Welcome back everyone, or maybe welcome for the very first time. If you are new here, I am so glad you found your way in. And if you've been with me for a while, well, you already know what tonight feels like. Get comfortable, wherever you are right now, curled up in bed, lying on the couch, headphones in the rest of the world already quiet. This is exactly where you're supposed to be. Before I begin, let me ask you something strange. When was the last time you truly had nowhere to be, not waiting for a notification, not scrolling, not halfway between sleep and whatever it is you were supposed to finish today? Just here, just breathing, just listening. Tonight I want to take you somewhere that no longer exists, a place that was once the loudest, most chaotic, most alive corner of any town in the known world. A place where kings and beggars brushed elbows without meaning to, where a woman might spend her entire life behind the same wooden counter, and a traveller might pass through only once, and both would carry the memory of that square for the rest of their days. I'm talking about the old marketplace, not the sanitized version, not the postcard. The real one with the mud and the shouting and the smell of blood from the butcher's corner mixing, somehow with the smell of honey cakes 2 stalls down. And here is what nobody ever tells you: it began long before you arrived. It began in the dark. Before we go there together, if this kind of storytelling is something you enjoy, a quiet voice, a slow journey history that actually feels like something, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and it tells me you want more nights like this one. Drop a comment too. Tell me where in the world you're watching from, what time it is, whether you made yourself a cup of tea. I read them. I love them. And if this is your first time here and something about tonight just feels right to you, say hello. The door is always open. Now, dim the lights a little if you can. Let the room get quiet around you, and let us go back to a morning that smelled like wet stone and wood smoke and something you could not quite name. It is somewhere in northern England around the year 1280. The town has a name, but it does not matter much. What matters is what happens here every Wednesday and every Saturday, without fail every week of the year except Christmas Day and Good Friday. The market. And right now it is not even 4 a.m. The sky is the colour of iron. There is no light except the distant flicker of a torch above the town gate, and the pale grey breath of people moving through the cold. They come before the sun does. That is the first thing most people never realise about an old marketplace. It did not just appear. Nobody showed up at 9 with a cup of coffee and unfolded a table. The marketplace was assembled piece by piece in darkness by people who'd already been awake for hours. The farmer from the village 5 miles out, he left home around 2 a.m. He loaded his cart by feel by memory because he had done it so many times his hands knew where everything was without his eyes having to check. Turnips in the sacks on the left, cabbages wrapped in cloth on the right, the 3 chickens alive and not happy about it in the wooden crate tied to the back. He walked beside his ox in the dark because the cart was too full for him to ride. 5 miles, in the mud, before sunrise, and here is the thing: he was not unusual. He was average. Most people in 14th century England lived just over 4 miles from their nearest market. That was considered normal. That was the acceptable distance between a person and the thing they absolutely needed. The marketplace itself was a permanent space, but it was never the same twice. In most English and French towns, it was a wide square, sometimes triangular, almost always positioned near the church. Not by accident. The church bell was the only reliable clock in town, and market hours were strictly tied to it. You were allowed to start selling when the bell rang a certain way. You had to stop when it rang again. Trading outside those hours in the dark before the bell or after it fell silent was illegal. It had a name actually. It was called forestalling, and it was taken very seriously. You could be fined. You could lose your stall. In some cases, you could be brought before the town court. Because the market was not just commerce. It was a controlled space with rules, with authority, with something approaching a constitution. The right to hold a market at all was granted by the king himself, or by a powerful lord through a document called a market charter. It was not cheap to obtain, and it was not given lightly. A charter meant the town collected fees from every stall holder, every week. It meant power. It meant money flowing into civic coffers. It meant the town mattered. England alone had more than 2,000 chartered markets by the late 13th century. 2,000, and every single one of them opened before the light came up. So who arrived first? The fishmongers. Always the fishmongers. Without exception, in every market town across medieval Europe, the fish sellers came first because they had no choice. Fish did not keep. If you arrived at a market with a barrel of salted herring or a basket of fresh river trout, you had a window maybe 4 or 5 hours in summer, slightly longer on a cold October morning, before what you were selling became something nobody wanted at any price. So the fishmongers came in the absolute dead of night. They came from river towns, from coastal villages, from anywhere water ran, and things with fins lived in it. They arranged their stalls with a kind of silent urgency, laying out their wares by torchlight, packing the fresh fish in whatever ice or cold water they had managed to bring and waiting. They were always gone by midday, or they were stuck. Right after them came the bread sellers. Actually, that is slightly misleading. The bakers had been awake since midnight. The bread was already baked by the time the market opened. In most medieval towns, private baking ovens were rare and expensive to maintain, so there were communal ovens, large stone structures usually operated by a baker who charged a fee to use the heat, and the bread sellers would have their loaves and rolls and small pastries ready long before anyone else had their stall set up. The smell of fresh bread in a market square was not romantic coincidence, it was strategy. It drifted across the square before the sun came up, and people followed it the way they always have, the way they always will. Nose first, hunger first, reasons somewhere behind. There was a hierarchy to all of it, though nobody wrote it down. The most established merchants, the ones who had held the same stall for years or even generations, had the best positions. Near the centre of the square, close to the market cross, visible from the main entrance, protected from the wind by the buildings on either side, those spots were not assigned at random. They were earned, negotiated, sometimes inherited. A wool merchant in Winchester in the 1290s might have stood in the same spot his father stood in, and his father before that. The position was worth something. People knew where to find him. Strangers coming into town for the first time would be told, go to the centre of the square, look for the blue awning. That is where Thomas the cloth dealer keeps his stall. The people at the edges, the new arrivals, the itinerant sellers, the farmers coming in for the first time with a surplus they needed to move, they set up where they could find space. Sometimes that meant the farthest corner half hidden behind a cart. Sometimes it meant standing in the mud with no table at all, just a cloth laid on the ground and whatever you had to sell arranged on top of it. The market cross, if you're not familiar, was a stone monument, sometimes quite beautiful, sometimes just a rough pillar with a carved top, that stood in the centre of the square. It was both a religious symbol, trade conducted under God's eye, fair dealing blessed by the church, and a practical marker. Measurements were sometimes taken from it. The market inspector, the man responsible for enforcing weights and standards, often began his morning rounds from there. But here is what I love about the market cross. It was also where you went if you had something to announce. Lost a horse. You went to the cross and said so out loud, looking for work. The cross. Had a dispute with your neighbour that you wanted witnesses to the cross. Someone had died and their goods were going to be sold. The cross. In a world without newspapers, without posting boards, without any form of public communication. As we understand it, the market cross was the town's announcement. Stand there and speak loudly enough and the whole square would hear you within the hour. Now, by the time the church bell rang to officially open trading, the square was already alive. Not bustling yet, that would come, but alive, the way a kitchen is alive before a big dinner. The movement of people who know what they are doing, who have done this before, who are quietly, methodically preparing for something that will, in about 2 hours, become completely overwhelming. Stalls were constructed from wooden boards and poles covered with canvas awnings in whatever colour the merchant could afford or had inherited. The colours actually meant something not officially but practically. You learned over years of going to the same market that the yellow and brown awning meant the cheese seller and the faded red one meant the leather worker, and the one that always had a small painted sign shaped like a boot hanging from the pole, well, that was the cobbler's widow who had kept her husband's stall going after he died of a fever the previous winter. Goods were arranged with considerable care. This sometimes surprises people. There is an assumption that medieval commerce was haphazard, just piles of stuff thrown together, grab what you want. But no. Stallholders in a competitive market knew exactly what they were doing. The best-looking items came to the front. The bruised apples went behind. The slightly worn leather belt was laid beside the new one because next to something better. It looked acceptable, and the price difference made it feel like a bargain. Medieval people were not naive. They were sharp, experienced, and deeply familiar with the economics of temptation. Animals were everywhere. This is something that really does not translate when we try to imagine an old marketplace. We think of stalls and goods and transactions. We do not think of the noise, because by mid-morning the livestock section of the market usually kept toward one end of the square downwind if the town was smart about such. Things would have brought in pigs, sheep, cattle, geese and chickens in numbers that turned a commercial transaction into something more like a farmyard disaster. Pigs in particular were notorious. They were not kept in pens. They were led in on ropes, and they objected to this, loudly and persistently. A pig in a medieval market square was a pig that had opinions about where it was going, and it expressed those opinions in a voice that carried several streets in every direction. The geese were nearly as bad. They were walked to market from farms sometimes miles away, yes, walked on their feet, which were sometimes coated in tar to harden them for the journey, and they arrived in groups of hundreds, honking with what can only be described as organised outrage. And the cattle were moved through the streets carefully, with drovers walking alongside them because a spooked ox in a narrow medieval street was the kind of problem that ruined your whole Wednesday and probably someone else's too. The smell of all of this mixed with the smoke from the bread ovens and the iron tang from the blacksmith's fire already, starting up in the corner, and the damp stone of the square itself warming slowly in the early morning light. There is no modern equivalent. There really is not. Here is something that often gets overlooked. Women were already there, not just as shoppers, as workers, as stallholders, as the people who had carried goods to market and would spend the entire day selling them. Egg sellers, dairy sellers, ale sellers, poultry sellers. These were predominantly women's roles in a medieval market, not because women were limited to small transactions, but because these goods moved through the household economy in a way that gave women both access and authority. A farm wife might manage the dairy production, the poultry flock, the household ale brewing, completely independently of her husband's work in the fields. The market was where that work translated into income, her income. Some women had stalls that had been in their families for generations. Others were widows who had inherited a husband's trade and simply kept going. Medieval widows had considerably more legal freedom than married women in many parts of Europe. A widow could enter contracts, hold property, run a business, and the market was often where that freedom became visible. They were there at dawn. They arranged their things with care. They knew their regulars by name. They knew which customers would try to argue the price down and which ones would pay without complaint if you looked them in the eye and held firm. The first hour just after the bell rang had a particular quality to it, slower, more deliberate. The serious buyers came early, the housewives, the servants of wealthy households, the cooks who had been given a list and a purse, and sent out to provision for the week. They moved through the stalls with purpose, checking quality, comparing prices, negotiating. In a medieval market, everything was negotiable. This was not an awkward exception to the norm. It was the norm. Fixed pricing did not really exist yet in the way we understand it. There were guidelines. Certainly the town could set a maximum price for bread based on the current cost of grain, and the market inspector enforced this. But for most goods, what you paid was what you and the seller agreed on, in the moment based on how much each of you wanted the deal to happen. This made the morning hour fascinating to watch. A woman examining a piece of cloth, running her thumb along the weave, not commenting, just looking. The cloth seller watching her without watching her arranging something else nearby waiting. She sets the cloth down, picks it up again, names a price. He shakes his head, names a different one. She begins to turn away. He says something. She stops. They arrive somewhere in the middle. That exchange, repeated thousands of times a day across the square in every language with every type of goods, was how a medieval economy actually functioned. Not in the great financial halls of Florence or the spice warehouses of Venice, but here in the mud, in the morning cold between two people who both knew what things were worth. By the time the sun had fully cleared the rooftops and the square was properly bright for the first time, the market had transformed into something else entirely. The early buyers had thinned out. In their place came everyone else. The people who came to market not just to buy, but to be there. To see who was around, to hear what had happened in the countryside this week. To check whether the wool merchant had finally gotten that shipment from the north, to find out whether the miller's daughter was still betrothed or whether that had fallen through. The medieval marketplace was the town's living newspaper. Every stall was a source of information. Merchants who travelled between towns brought news of weather, of wars, of prices in other places, of roads that were passable or not. A trader from a cloth fair 2 counties over might casually mention, while making change, that there had been flooding on the northern road and the salt merchant from the coast would not be arriving this week. And that one piece of information spreading outward from that one stall could affect the purchasing decisions of half the people in the square before the next hour was out. There is something I want you to hold on to before we move further into this world. The marketplace was not just a place where things were bought and sold. It was a place where a community decided together what everything was worth. Not just the bread and the leather and the fish. Worth in a larger sense. What a fair deal looked like, what constituted trust, what someone's word meant when they made a promise in front of witnesses, what happened when they broke it. Every market day those questions were being answered hundreds of times by ordinary people making ordinary decisions. And the day was only just beginning. We've barely gotten past sunrise, there are still hours to go. The voices are about to get louder, and the stories behind each stall are stranger, sadder, and more surprising than you might expect. Because up next, we're going to talk about the thing you heard before you saw anything. Before you could smell the bread or find the square or know which stall sold what. You heard the voices. The calls and cries of the market, each one in its own language, its own art form, its own survival strategy. And what those voices were actually saying beneath the words is something that will stay with you long after tonight is over. Stay close, we are just getting started. Hey, you came back. Or maybe you never left. Maybe you fell asleep somewhere in the middle of part 1 and woke up still thinking about the fishmongers in the dark and the bread smell drifting across a cold stone square before the sun was even up. If that is the case, good. That is exactly what this is supposed to feel like. Tonight we're going deeper into the marketplace, not into the stalls, not into the transactions, not yet. Tonight we are going to listen. Because here is the thing about an old marketplace that nobody ever really talks about. You heard it before you saw it. Long before you turned the corner and the square opened up in front of you, long before you saw the stalls or the crowds or the livestock or the flash of a silk bolt catching the light, you heard it. A wall of human sound layered and overlapping, and somehow underneath all the chaos organized. Each voice doing something specific. Each cry meaning something precise. A language essentially. One that had no written form, no grammar book, no school to teach it, but one that every person in a medieval town understood perfectly. And some of those voices survive, not as recordings obviously, but as words, written down usually by people who found them remarkable enough to preserve. What they left behind changes everything about how you picture a market day. But before we go there, if tonight is giving you something you needed, whether that is a slower pace or a story that feels like it actually happened, or just a voice to drift off to, I would love it if you would leave a quick like before you close your eyes, or subscribe if you have not yet. It takes about 3 seconds and it genuinely keeps this going. Drop a comment if you feel like it. Something small just where you are in the world right now, or what time it is, or what you're lying in the dark thinking about. I read everyone. Now pull the blanket up a little closer, because the market is waking up and it is loud. Picture a street in London sometime in the early 1400s. A young man walks down Cheapside. He's from the countryside and he does not have much money. The poem that describes him, a sardonic little masterpiece written around the year 1410 and known as London Lick Penny, makes that clear from the first line. He walks through the city with empty pockets and full ears, and the voices come at him from every direction. Hot peascods, strawberry ripened cherry in the rise, ribs of beef and many a pie, or sheep's feet. These are actual lines from that poem. Not reconstructions, not educated guesses. These are the exact calls, or as close to exact as a poem written 6 centuries ago can give us that a person walking through a London market in the early 15th century would have heard. Hot peascods, fresh green peas still in the pod sold warm, hot sheep's feet, which sounds alarming but was a perfectly normal street snack. You can think of it as the medieval equivalent of something you would buy from a cart at a fair, slightly questionable, surprisingly satisfying. The poem's narrator cannot afford any of it. He walks through the whole thing, hungry coat pulled tight, watching the vendors shout at him and at everyone else, and at nobody in particular. And what he describes, almost without meaning to, is the entire sonic architecture of a medieval marketplace. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. In a world where almost nobody could read sound was the primary technology of commerce, we think about literacy as a basic thing. Now, of course, people can read, of course there are signs, of course you can look at a label or a price tag or a menu and know what you are getting. None of that existed in a medieval market. There were no price tags, there were no menus, there were no signs in the modern sense, or if there were, they were symbols, pictures, shapes, the boot hanging outside the cobbler's, the 3 golden balls above the moneylender, not words. Words were spoken, shouted more accurately, and the vendors who shouted the loudest, the most memorably, the most skillfully, those were the ones who survived. This created something genuinely interesting. An entire profession of oral advertising passed down through families, refined over generations, as carefully crafted as any art form. A good market cry had rhythm. It had to, because rhythm is what makes something stick in the ear. You heard it once and it repeated in your head. It lodged there. 2 hours later, crossing back through the square on your way home, you would hear that same cry and think, oh right, the cherry seller, and you would stop. A good cry also had pitch. Higher voices carried differently than lower ones. A woman selling eggs had learned possibly from her mother, who learned it from her mother exactly how to shape a call, so it bounced off the stone buildings on either side of the square and reached the upper windows of the houses where women were leaning out listening for what was available that morning. Some vendors sang their cries, not performed singing, nothing theatrical, just a rise and fall of tone that made the syllables easier to carry on the air. There is something almost musical, almost haunting about that image. There was a practical calculus behind all of this. Different goods required different kinds of cries. Perishables, fish, berries, hot food, fresh bread meat got the most urgent calls. The fastest tempo, the highest volume, the most repetitive rhythm. Because a fishmonger who could not move his stock by midday was not going to have a good day financially, and everyone in the market knew it. The urgency was real, and the voice reflected that. Cloth merchants, by contrast, rarely shouted. They called a lower, smoother invitation. Fine cloth of lawn, Paris thread. Something that implied you had time, that this transaction was worth your consideration, that quality people made deliberate choices rather than impulsive ones. It was a different register entirely, and it was calculated. The spice sellers were quieter still, almost conspiratorial sometimes. You did not shout about pepper and saffron the same way you shouted about hot sheep's feet. Spices were expensive, refined, associated with wealth and sophistication. The spice seller leaned forward and spoke to you as though sharing something valuable, which he was actually, because a small quantity of saffron in the late medieval period cost more than most labouring people earned in a day. He wanted you to feel chosen, to feel like someone worth doing business with. Funny how little has changed. Now, underneath all of this, underneath the calls and the pitches and the rhythms, there was another layer, one that was not for customers at all. The coded language between sellers. Medieval vendors in a market were competitors, yes, but they were also a community. They knew each other. Many of them had stalls in the same square every market day for years. They had developed entirely informally a set of signals that existed in plain sight or plain hearing but meant nothing to an outsider. A certain repetition in a cry might mean someone is watching. Do not lower your price yet. A shift in tone, almost imperceptible, might mean a particularly wealthy buyer is heading your way. A pause in the calling, a vendor suddenly going quiet for a moment, might mean the market inspector is coming. Some of this is inference. We cannot always prove the coded layers with documentation, because by definition the code was never written down. But historians who have studied medieval market records, guild ordinances, and accounts of market disputes have pieced together enough to say with confidence, vendors talk to each other in ways that customers were not meant to understand. That is not conspiracy. That is just what happens when people do the same job in the same place for long enough. They develop shorthand. They develop a private vocabulary. It is the same thing that happens in any restaurant kitchen, any hospital ward, any office where the same people show up every day and deal with the same situations. The market had its language, and only the market people spoke it fluently. There was one voice in the marketplace that stood above all the others. Not because it was the loudest, though it often was. Not because it was the most skillful, though that was certainly the goal. Because it was official. The town crier. Most people have a vague image of this figure in their heads. A large person in a fancy outfit ringing a bell, shouting, "Hear ye, hear ye." And while the fancy outfit is probably an exaggeration from later centuries, the rest of it is basically right. The word oyez, which the crier called out to open an announcement, came from the Old French, meaning simply, listen. It was the formal signal, stop what you're doing, because what comes next matters. The town crier was appointed usually by the local lord or the town council. He was paid. He was in a real sense the government's voice made audible. Royal proclamations, new laws, changes in market regulations, notices about debts and disputes and deaths, all of it came through him. In a population where literacy was the exception rather than the rule, he was the equivalent of the newspaper, the public notice board, and the emergency alert system rolled into one. And he operated in the market square because that was where the people were. There is a record from the town of Clare in Suffolk, a register of marketplace announcements covering the period from the early 1600s through the early 1700s, that gives us one of the most detailed pictures we have of what an official market cry actually sounded like. Goods recovered from theft debts owed by individuals who had left town, sales of property, warnings about counterfeit coins circulating in the area. All of it read aloud in the square by a voice that everyone was obligated to listen to. You could be fined for ignoring the town crier. Think about that for a second. In a world of constant noise, of competing voices and animal sounds and cartwheels on cobblestones, someone had figured out that the only way to guarantee attention was to make inattention illegal. Read, there is a particular kind of sound that comes up again and again in descriptions of medieval markets, and I want to spend a moment on it because I think it captures something true about what these places felt like. It is the sound of a woman's voice carrying across stone. Not shouting, projecting, there is a difference. The egg sellers, the dairy women, the herb sellers, the alewives who sold their brewing at market, these were often the most practiced voices in the square. They had the experience of years, sometimes decades, of making themselves heard in a noisy place without sounding desperate or aggressive. Because the social expectations for women in a public market were different from those for men. A man could shout freely. A woman who shouted too aggressively risked being dismissed, mocked, accused of being coarse. So they found another way, a clear carrying tone, steady, unhurried. The kind of voice that does not ask for your attention so much as simply assume it. There is something almost serene about that when you think about it. A woman who has been selling eggs every Wednesday and Saturday since she was a girl, standing behind her stall, not competing with the chaos around her, but simply existing within it, present, certain, reliable. People knew her voice. They moved toward it, not because it was the loudest, but because it was the most familiar. In a marketplace full of strangers and noise and negotiation, familiarity was worth something. It still is. Let me tell you about something that confused historians for a long time. In many records of medieval markets you find complaints, lots of them. Merchants complaining that other merchants were crying their wares too close to someone else's stall. Vendors being brought before the market court for excessive crying, or crying before the bell. There are even records of physical confrontations that started with one person accusing another of deliberately crying over their call, drowning it out on purpose. This is, when you think about it, a form of acoustic warfare. If you could make your neighbour's voice inaudible, you could take his customers, not through better goods, not through lower prices, just through sheer vocal dominance. Standing close enough, being loud enough, being repetitive enough, you could essentially erase someone else's signal with your own. The market authorities eventually had to regulate this. There are records from English markets stipulating how close vendors could stand to each other, how much space there had to be between stalls of competing goods. Part of this was about preventing physical altercations, yes, but part of it was also about sound. About protecting the right of every stallholder to be heard. It had never occurred to me before I started thinking about this that the right to be heard acoustically, literally in a crowded square, might be something people once had to fight for, and that the fight could be that petty and that human. There was one more voice in the medieval market, the quietest one, the voice that said nothing, because not every transaction was announced. Not every piece of commerce happened in the open air with witnesses and cries and the full theatre of the square. Some goods were sold in silence. A nod, a folded cloth, a coin passed hand to hand with no word spoken. This was usually goods that were expensive enough that discretion mattered. Occasionally it was goods that were not entirely legal, but more often it was simply a reflection of the fact that trust in a medieval marketplace was sometimes expressed through exactly this, the willingness to do business without the drama. You know what this is worth. I know what this is worth. We do not need to perform the transaction. We just make it. The most experienced merchants, the most established stallholders, the people who'd been coming to the same square for 20 or 30 years, they often operated this way with their best customers. No crying. No negotiating, just the thing and the price and the exchange. That silence was its own kind of language. The loudest voice in the market was not always the most important one. Something happens when you understand this, when you realize that the medieval marketplace was not just a place of noise, but a place of layered, sophisticated communication. It shifts how you picture the people who lived within it. These were not simple people navigating a simple world. They were people who had built without writing it down, without formalizing it, without anyone designing it from the top, a complete and functioning system for turning sound into commerce, for encoding information in voice, for protecting their livelihoods through the quality of a single shouted phrase. The cry was not decoration, it was the mechanism, and now it is gone, completely. You cannot hear it anywhere on earth, but somewhere in the frequency of a voice projecting across an open space, somewhere in the rhythm of someone calling your attention to something, they want you to notice there is an echo of it. Something older than advertising, older than branding, older than marketing as a concept. Just a person standing in a square saying, "Here I am. Come closer. I have something for you." The voices are fading now as the light begins to shift. In a little while, we'll move away from sound and into something else entirely. Something you cannot escape in an old marketplace no matter how hard you try. The smells. Every vendor had a scent signature. Every section of the square had its own invisible marker. And if you knew what you were smelling, you could navigate the entire marketplace with your eyes closed. Up next, the smell map of a market nobody drew but everybody knew. Stay with me. If you are still here, still listening, still somewhere comfortable in the dark, I am really glad. And if you just found this and you're wondering what kind of story this is, it is the slow kind. The kind where nothing explodes and nobody's in danger, but somehow you cannot stop listening. At least that is what I am going for. Tonight we're going somewhere that no map has ever captured. Somewhere invisible. Somewhere that existed only in the noses and the memories of people who have been dead for 600 years. We're going into the smell of an old marketplace. And I want to start with a question that might sound strange. If you woke up in the middle of a medieval market with your eyes covered, not knowing what town you were in, not knowing the language, not knowing a single person around you, could you find the bread? I think you could. I think anyone could. Because in a world before refrigeration, before packaging, before the neutralizing miracle of modern air conditioning, smell did not just accompany the marketplace. Smell was the map. Bestand. Before we go there, if you have been finding these stories worthwhile, a like or a subscription means more than you might think. It helps this reach the next person who needs a quiet place to land at the end of the day. Drop a comment too. I love knowing who is out there in the dark with me. Tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me if you are already halfway asleep. That honestly makes me happy to hear. Now settle in. Let the room be as quiet as you can make it. Because what we are about to explore never made it into a history book. Nobody drew it. Nobody recorded it. But it was as real and as functional as any street sign you've ever followed. Here is the thing about smell that is easy to forget. For most of human history, it was the primary navigation system. Not roads, not signs, not addresses, smell. A hunter could follow game through a forest by scent before there were paths. A sailor could smell land before he could see it. A baker's family 3 streets away could tell by the particular quality of warmth in the air whether the oven had been lit that morning. And in a medieval marketplace, a place where hundreds of vendors gathered in a space no larger than a city block selling dozens of different types of goods, often in unfamiliar arrangements that changed slightly. Each market day smell was how you knew where you were. There was in every functioning medieval market in Europe what we might now call a scent geography, an invisible architecture of odours that divided the square into zones as clearly as any wall could have. You did not need to see the fish section to know it was to the north. You did not need to read a sign to know that the apothecary was on the eastern edge. You walked forward until your nose told you to turn. This was not accidental. It was in many cases the direct result of deliberate policy. Zaya, let us start at the edge of town, before you even enter the market proper, because the very first smell you encountered in a medieval market approach did not come from inside the square. It came from outside it, sometimes from a considerable distance. The tanners, leather making in the Middle Ages was one of the most important industries in existence. Leather was everywhere. It was in your shoes, your belt, your saddle, the bindings of your books, the covers on your furniture, the harness on your horse. The demand for it was enormous, and the process of making it was without any softening of the language spectacular in its awfulness. To turn an animal hide into leather you needed several things. You needed the hide itself stripped from the carcass. You needed something alkaline to remove the hair, and medieval tanners typically used a lime solution, or in some cases fermented urine collected in barrels from the street. You needed tannin to cure the leather, which came from crushed oak bark, and you needed large vats to soak the hides in this mixture for weeks or months at a time. Fermented urine, rotting hide, decomposing hair, months of soaking in dark liquid. The smell that resulted was, by multiple historical accounts, powerful enough to cause headaches and nausea in people who passed nearby. There is a record from Nottingham in the medieval period noting that the stench from the local tanneries was so severe that even rats avoided the area, which as a side note meant that the area had one of the lowest rates of plague infection in the region. The rats could not stand it either. Because of this, tanners were almost universally pushed to the outskirts of towns. Not just in England, in France, in Germany, in the Low Countries in Italy, every city that had any kind of organised governance eventually passed rules requiring tanneries to operate at a specific distance from the centre of town near rivers or streams, where they could dispose of their waste without fouling the drinking water, and as far from the marketplace as possible. The smell of leather came to market in finished form in the goods sold by the leather worker and the cobbler. The process that created those goods was kept as far as any medieval town council could manage well out of sight and downwind. So, you're approaching town, the market is somewhere ahead, and the first thing you smell is the sweet rot of tannery work carried on the breeze from the edge of the river district. That smell means civilization. It means the town is here. It means you are close. You enter the town gate. You follow the road inward. Now the smells change. Wood smoke first almost always. Medieval towns burned wood constantly for cooking, for heating, for the communal baking ovens that were one of the central features of urban life. In winter especially, the entire town existed inside a soft cloud of wood smoke. You breathed it all day. It settled into your clothes, your hair, your skin. By the time you got home at night, you smelled like a fire yourself, and nobody found this remarkable because everyone smelled exactly the same. Beneath the wood smoke, something else. Damp stone perhaps, particularly in the morning before the day warmed up, when the road itself released a particular cold mineral smell that anyone who has walked through a very old European town in early spring will recognize immediately. It is not unpleasant. It is the smell of a place that has been here for a long time, and then threading through everything else, getting stronger as you get closer to the square. Bread. The bread smell deserves its own moment. It was not subtle. It was not a whisper of something pleasant in the background. It was active physical enveloping. Medieval baking ovens burned hot, and they burned all morning, and the yeast smell of baking dough carried for several streets in every direction. In a world where breakfast, as we understand it, barely existed, where most people ate their first real meal of the day only after several hours of morning work, that bread smell was not just pleasant. It was urgent. It activated something deep and involuntary. Your stomach responded before your mind did, and the bakers knew this. They knew it the way anyone who feeds people for a living eventually learns what hunger does to decision-making. The positioning of the bread stalls at the market was never random. They were placed where the wind could carry the smell inward into the square, reaching the people who had not yet made their way to the food section. The smell was the advertisement. The smell was the first argument for any purchase that morning. Historians studying medieval urban sensory experience have noted that smell functioned as a form of public information in pre-modern cities. In a world without written signage that most people could read without visual advertising as a concept, the sensory landscape of a marketplace carried the same information that a modern person gets from a storefront window, a labelled shelf, a brand logo. You smelled your way to what you needed. You smelled your way to what you wanted. The bread got you to the market. Then the other smells sorted you into sections. Moving further into the square, the scent landscape became more complicated. To one side, the cheese stalls. Wheels of hard cheese, rounds of soft cheese, blocks of aged cheese, fresh curds wrapped in cloth. The smell was rich animal, faintly sour, distinctive enough that it created its own small zone within the market. And because most cheese production was local seasonal and tied to what each farm happened to be making that week, the smell of the cheese section could tell an experienced nose not just what cheeses were available, but roughly where they had come from. A sharper edge meant harder, older cheese. A mildness meant fresh curds from that morning. The herb sellers were nearby in many markets, not by coincidence. Fresh herbs, dried herbs, medicinal plants, roots and flowers with uses both culinary and pharmaceutical. The smell they created was clean green complex. Lavender and rosemary and thyme and mint and a dozen other things layered together into something that served in a way as an olfactory palate cleanser between the heavier food smells around it. The herb section was often where you caught your breath. Then the fish. We talked in part 1 about the fishmongers arriving first and leaving by midday, and part of the reason for that midday departure was olfactory as much as commercial. Fresh fish on a warm morning did not stay fresh for long, and the smell of fish that had passed its best moment was something that even medieval market-goers who were accustomed to some fairly extreme odours had opinions about. There are records from English markets of formal complaints brought against fishmongers who continued selling after their stock had turned. The market inspector, the same official we mentioned who enforced weights and measures, could be called in to assess the quality of fish by smell and sight, and could order a vendor to remove their goods if they were judged unfit. The fact that there was an official with the authority to smell your fish and declare it unacceptable is, I think, one of the more charming details of medieval market administration. The fish section tended to be positioned in well-organised markets near one edge of the square, near the street that led most directly to the water source, the river, the well, the drainage channel, because water was needed constantly for keeping the fish cold and for washing the stall surface, and near the edge rather than the centre, because even in medieval times nobody wanted to spend their morning haggling over cloth in close proximity to a barrel of aging herring. Deeper into the square, a different kind of smell entirely. The spice merchants occupied what might genuinely be called the most valuable sensory real estate in the market. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, saffron the most expensive of them all, that vivid orange thread with its warm, honeyed, almost metallic scent. The spice section smelled like wealth. It smelled like distance. It smelled like places that most of the people walking through that market would never see India. The Spice Islands, the markets of Constantinople and Alexandria, from which these goods had travelled sometimes for months across land and sea, before arriving at this particular stall in this particular English or French or German town. There is a remarkable historical record from early medieval Constantinople that speaks directly to how seriously the connection between smell and commerce was taken. According to records from the city's commercial governance, and Constantinople had extremely detailed laws about who could sell what where, and under what conditions the spice markets were required to be positioned in a specific location in the city. Not for practical reasons, not for traffic flow or proximity to the harbour, so that the scent of the spices would drift toward the churches, and not coincidentally toward the imperial palace. The emperors of Byzantium understood something that modern marketers would recognize instantly. Smell creates desire. Smell creates aspiration. The right smell positioned correctly made a neighborhood feel prosperous, refined, civilized. Spice smell drifting through the sacred space of a church made the church feel more sacred. The same spice smell reaching the imperial palace said without a word, wealth flows through this city. The world comes here. In a medieval European marketplace centuries later, the spice merchant occupied the same psychological position. Standing near that stall surrounded by scents that cost more than most people earned in a week, you were for a moment adjacent to a world you normally could not reach. The smell was aspirational. It was intoxicating. It was not infrequently the reason people spent more than they intended to. And then there were the smells nobody was supposed to notice, or rather the smells that people noticed all too well, and that the town authorities spent considerable energy trying to manage and contain. The butcher's section, blood-raw meat, bone offal, the physical material of an open-air butcher's stall in warm weather, was something that medieval towns dealt with under a constant low-level sense of crisis. There was no refrigeration. There was no sealed packaging. There was no invisible infrastructure removing the biological reality of meat from the customer's experience. You saw the carcasses. You smelled what carcasses smell like in the open air, and then you bought your dinner from it. By the late medieval period in London, the situation around the city's butchers had become severe enough that the slaughter of large animals inside the city was formally banned. The blood and waste from the shambles that was the name for the butcher's area, a word that has survived into modern English and now means any kind of chaotic disaster. Though originally it just meant a meat market, the waste attracted dogs, pigs and rats, fouled the drainage channels and created a smell that generated complaints from neighbouring residents for blocks in every direction. The solution was not to stop selling meat. Obviously, the solution was to move the killing further away and sell only the prepared product in the market. Even so, the smell remained, and medieval people had their strategies for navigating it. Posies of fresh herbs carried in the hand, not as decoration, though that was part of it. As a portable scent barrier, something you could raise to your nose as you move through a particularly unpleasant section of the market, replacing one smell with another. The same principle, incidentally, that later became formalized in the carrying of perfumed pomanders during the plague years when foul smell was believed to carry disease, and a good smell was believed to protect against it. The medical theory was wrong as it turned out, but the instinct was not entirely misguided. Strong smells in a medieval market often did correlate with places you wanted to be cautious around. There is one smell we have not talked about yet, and I have been saving it. Not because it is the most interesting in the conventional sense, but because of what it represents. At some point in the middle of a busy market day, if you found yourself in the right corner of the square near the dyer's section, near where cloth had been treated with indigo or woad or madder root to give it colour, the smell changed into something completely alien to everything else around it. Dye smells were chemical in a way that nothing else in the market was. Sharp, earthy, faintly acrid. Indigo, which came from plants fermented in great vats and then dried, had a smell that one medieval writer described as like something between mud and fire. Woad, which was the primary blue dye used in Northern Europe before indigo became widely available, had its own particular quality, fermented, sulphurous, not quite like anything else. And the remarkable thing about these smells is that they were smells of transformation. Raw wool had one smell, dyed wool had another. The process that changed it, the vats and the heat and the chemistry, created a third smell, entirely one that marked the transition between ordinary material and something with colour, with value, with a kind of beauty that the undyed version could never have. In the cloth quarter of a medieval market standing near a bolt of deep blue fabric that had come from a dyer's vat through some process most buyers did not fully understand. The smell of that transformation lingered. It was part of the cloth, part of what you were buying. People who studied medieval olfactory culture have argued that smell in the pre-modern world was morally weighted in a way we have lost. Good smells, spices, incense, fresh herbs, flowers were associated with virtue, with God, with health and prosperity. Bad smells were associated with sin, with disease, with moral failure. This is why church incense was so important. This is why the wealthy went to such lengths to perfume their homes and their persons. The marketplace, containing every possible smell from the sublime to the truly terrible, existed in the middle of that moral landscape. It was a place where you encountered the full range, where the smell of baking bread coexisted with the smell of open slaughter, and where the scent of saffron worth more than gold by weight hung in the air 50 feet from the scent of fermenting fish. That coexistence, that constant navigating of contrast was what the marketplace was. Zoar, there is something I want you to imagine before we leave this part of the story. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. You are standing in the middle of the square. It is mid-morning. The sun is fully up and the air is warming. Around you in every direction is the layered, contradictory, overwhelming sensory world of the market. To your left, bread and smoke. Behind you, the cold mineral edge of the fish stalls and the sound of water being poured. Ahead, something green and complex, the herb sellers. And somewhere off to your right, faint but unmistakable, something warm and spiced and impossibly far away. You do not need a sign. You do not need a map. You do not need to ask anyone where anything is. Your nose already knows. That is not a small thing to understand about these people and how they moved through their world. They carried inside themselves a navigational knowledge that nobody wrote down, because nobody needed to. It was just part of living in a body in that place at that time. We have lost most of it, not because our noses have changed, but because the world around us has been so thoroughly deodorized, so packaged and sealed and climate-controlled and filtered, that we no longer need smell to navigate. The information is delivered another way now, but the capacity's still there, in you right now tonight. Your nose can do this. You just have not needed to ask it to in a very long time. The smells are fading now as we move away from the square in our minds, but there is still so much left to see. Because all of this, the navigation by scent, the geography of the market, the invisible architecture of odors, was just the world you walked through on your way to the people. And the people are where things get complicated. 3 of them specifically. 3 trades that formed the absolute backbone of every market in medieval Europe. 3 roles so essential that if any one of them failed to show up, the whole day's commerce tilted. 3 lives so different from each other that they could stand in the same square 50 feet apart and exist in entirely separate worlds. The fishmonger, the baker, the butcher. We're going to spend some real time with them next, because their stories are stranger and sadder and more human than you would expect. Stay with me. There is something I want to tell you before tonight's story begins. You have made it to part 4. That might not sound like much, but think about it. 4 evenings of sitting quietly, of letting go of whatever the day threw at you, of choosing a slow story over everything else your phone wanted you to look at. That is not nothing. That is actually a choice, and not a small one. So thank you for being here, in whatever corner of the world you're in at whatever hour it happens to be. Tonight we're going to meet 3 people. They never knew each other. They might have stood 50 feet apart in the same market square for 20 years and never exchanged more than a nod, but they were bound together by something more fundamental than friendship. Every town needed them. Every market day was built around them, and each of their lives was governed by a set of rules, pressures, and dangers that most modern people would find completely astonishing. The fishmonger, the baker, the butcher. 3 trades, 3 entirely different worlds. One morning in the market. Before we begin, if something in these stories has stayed with you, if you have found yourself thinking about the old marketplace at odd moments in your day, please share this with someone who might feel the same way. A subscription or a like keeps this going, and a comment, especially one that tells me what time it is where you are right now, or what you are listening on, those genuinely make my evening. I read everyone. Now let the room go quiet. We are going back to the square. Lord. Start with the fishmonger, because the fishmonger always started first. We touched on this before. The fishmongers arrived before dawn, before anyone else, because they had no choice. But what we have not talked about yet is the extraordinary chain of events that had to happen before a fish could reach that stall at all. Take London in the late 14th century. The city needed enormous quantities of fish. Not just because people liked it, though they did, but because the medieval Catholic Church forbade the eating of meat on a significant portion of days throughout the year. Fridays, obviously, but also Saturdays in many traditions, and all of Lent and the eve of major saints' days and Wednesdays in some areas. When you add it up, somewhere between a third and half of all days in the calendar year were days when the church expected you not to eat meat. Fish was not a substitute for meat. Fish was a necessity. The demand was non-negotiable, and the supply chains that grew up to meet it were astonishing in their reach and complexity. Fresh sea fish from the English coast reached London through a network of specialised carriers called rippiers, middlemen, who made their living entirely from the rapid transport of perishable goods inland. These were not wealthy merchants. They were working people, often travelling at night to avoid the heat of the day, carrying packed panniers of flat fish plaice, and sole, primarily fish, that could survive the journey better than most on horses, through roads that were, depending on the season, ranging from difficult to genuinely impassable. From ports like Rye on the south coast, a rippier might travel through the night to reach London before dawn. Not occasionally, regularly. That was the job. The fish could not wait, and so the person carrying it could not either. By the time that fish reached the London market, it had already survived a journey that most of us would not volunteer for, and it still had to be sold before the sun made it unsellable. The London fishmongers were by the late 13th century one of the most powerful guilds in the entire city. The Worshipful Company of Fishmongers received its first royal charter from King Edward I in 1272. Their market regulations were formally approved in 1279, and within a generation they had become something close to untouchable, politically connected, financially formidable, and deeply embedded in the governance of the city. In the 14th century, as many as 40 fishmongers sat on the City of London's Court of Aldermen. Several served as Lord Mayor. The fishmonger at a market stall, exhausted from the journey racing the sun to sell his stock, that person existed within a structure of power that extended all the way to the king's court. The trade was that important. The regulation was that serious. There were rules about how fish could be sold. No fish could be kept in London beyond the second day without being sold. If it was unsold, it was forfeit. No fishmonger was permitted to water fish more than twice to keep it looking fresh. Breaking that rule meant fines and the marketplace stocks. You could not store fish in a cellar to sell at inflated prices later. You could not buy fish before the king's own buyers had made their purchases. Profit was limited in some periods to a penny in the shilling, and yet despite all of this regulation, people still cheated, because of course they did. The temptation was enormous. A barrel of fish that looked fresh was worth something. A barrel of fish that clearly was not was worth nothing. The distance between those two states was often ambiguous, and ambiguity in any commercial environment is where fraud is born. Now, turn your attention away from the water and toward the oven. The baker's life was regulated too, more strictly in some ways than any other trade in the medieval market. In England, in the year 1266, King Henry III codified a law called the Assize of Bread and Ale. It was actually a revival of older practices going back at least to the reign of Henry II. This was not a new idea so much as a new formalisation of something towns had been trying to manage for a long time. The law was specific and detailed in a way that would feel almost familiar to a modern food safety inspector. The price of a loaf of bread was fixed, always the same. What changed as the price of wheat rose and fell with the harvest was the size of the loaf. When grain was cheap, your penny bought you a larger loaf. When grain was expensive, the same penny bought you a smaller one. The baker was not allowed to simply raise prices. He was required to adjust weight instead, and that weight was measured and verified. This sounds reasonable. It was actually. It was a genuine attempt to protect consumers from the kind of exploitation that is depressingly predictable when you have a basic necessity and a concentrated group of people who control the supply. The punishment for getting it wrong for selling a loaf that was underweight began with fines. First offence, pay up. Second offence, pay more. But by the third serious violation, the consequences escalated sharply. Your oven could be destroyed. Your bread could be forfeit entirely. You could be permanently banned from the baking trade. And in between those formal legal penalties, there was something older and more visceral. The pillory. If you were caught selling significantly underweight bread, you could be strapped to a hurdle, a kind of wooden frame, and dragged through the streets of the town while your defective loaves were carried in front of you on a pole, and someone walked alongside proclaiming your crime to everyone watching. There is a real record of this happening. A London baker named William Chester was dragged from the Guildhall all the way through Cheapside to Temple Bar. That is not a short journey through medieval London, so that his fellow bakers could see what happened when you cheated. Another baker, a man named Richard Hayne, had adulterated his bread with sand. Sand. In the bread. He made the same journey to Newgate Prison on the hurdle bread, on a lance in front of him, the crowd making sure he understood what they thought of it. In 1327, a group of offending bakers were placed in the pillory with slabs of unbaked dough hung around their necks. Medieval justice had a flair for the thematic. Here is the thing about the baker that is easy to miss if you only look at the punishments. The pressure was real. A baker's income depended entirely on the price of grain, which fluctuated with the weather, with the harvest, with events entirely outside any individual's control. You could be running a perfectly honest operation in a normal year, and then find yourself caught between a bad harvest driving grain prices up, and a fixed bread price that could not rise with it, which meant your loaves were getting smaller and smaller, your customers were getting angrier and angrier, and your margin was shrinking toward nothing. Some historians who have studied the economics of medieval bread production have argued that the assize was, despite its good intentions, structurally imperfect. It assumed a level of predictability in grain markets that the medieval world simply did not have. The bakers who ended up on the hurdle were not always villains. Some of them were people who'd made a desperate calculation and lost. That does not make the fraud right, but it makes it human. The extra loaf that bakers came to add to orders, the famous baker's dozen 13 instead of 12, is thought by many historians to have originated precisely from this anxiety. Give the customer a little more than they paid for just to be safe, just to make sure nobody could come back and say the weight was short. A bread tax on your own peace of mind. That is what it feels like to run a business under that kind of scrutiny. You give away one extra loaf every time, not because you are generous, but because you are afraid. And now the butcher. Walk with me to the far end of the square, past the fish stalls, past the bread sellers, past the cheese, past the herbs, past the sound of the cloth merchant and the blacksmith's distant fire. Here is where the buildings narrow. In York, England, there is a street that has been there since before the Norman conquest. It appears in the Domesday Book of 1086, when 2 butchers' stalls were recorded near the church of St. Crux. The street still exists. You can walk it today. In some sections, you can literally stretch out your arms and touch the buildings on both sides at once. It is called the shambles. That word shambles comes from the Old English semel, meaning a bench or shelf. The shelves on which butchers displayed their meat. Over centuries, the word came to mean the entire meat market section of a town, then the street where butchers worked then. Because of what that street looked and smelled and felt like on a busy market day, it came to mean exactly what it means now. A complete and utter mess. And the thing is, the original was genuinely that. The buildings on the shambles in York were designed with a specific practical purpose in mind. They overhang the street significantly upper floors jutting out over lower ones, creating a canopy effect that kept the sun off the meat displayed on the wide sills below. Because an hour of direct sunlight on raw meat in summer was the difference between a sale and a loss. The architecture was food preservation. The narrow street shaded the product. Behind each shop was a slaughterhouse. Animals walked into the back of the building and did not walk out. The waste blood offal guts bone was thrown into channels cut into the pavement on either side of the street channels, designed to slope toward a drainage point where the material could wash away. Twice a week, the butchers would flush the channels with water. In between those washings, the channel held what you would expect it to hold. People walked through it. Every day, market day in particular, you watched where you put your feet. The butcher occupied a strange social position in medieval life. On one hand, the trade was essential. Meat was status. Meat was calories. The ability to supply it reliably in sufficient quantity to a hungry town was a form of power. London's butchers were like the fishmongers, politically organised and commercially formidable. The Worshipful Company of Butchers is one of the oldest livery companies in the city. On the other hand, the work itself was considered coarse, bloody, associated with violence, however domestic and commercial that violence was. A butcher was not a gentle occupation. It required a certain detachment from the physical reality of what was happening day after day in the back of the shop. There were regulations. You were required to pay a tax on each animal processed. You were prohibited from selling meat that was diseased or unfit. You were required to display your goods in the open market, no selling from the back, no private transactions that bypassed inspection. And if you were caught selling bad meat, the punishment could include destruction of the offending goods and public humiliation. The guild inspected. The market inspector passed through. Customers who knew what they were looking at examined the colour, the texture, the smell of what was on offer. But still there were ways to cheat. A pig that had been ill could be slaughtered quickly and its meat sold before anyone looked too closely. A cut could be presented as something more expensive than it was. The weight of offal could be included in measurements where customers expected to be buying muscle. The butcher's trade, like the fishmongers, like the bakers, existed in that permanent tension between the genuine service it provided and the constant temptation created by desperate customers, tight margins, and a product that could turn from valuable to worthless in a matter of hours. 3 trades, 3 entirely different pressures. The fishmonger raced time on 2 fronts. The journey that brought the fish and the morning sun that started destroying it the moment it arrived. The baker raced mathematics, the price of grain, against a fixed selling price year after year, harvest after harvest, with public humiliation waiting for those who lost the calculation. The butcher raced biology, the fundamental fact that meat was once alive, that it contained things that could make you sick, and that the line between fresh and dangerous was not always visible to the naked eye. And yet all 3 of them showed up, every market day or nearly so, in winter cold and summer heat, in years when the harvest failed and grain prices crushed every margin, in the years immediately after the Black Death when perhaps 1/3 of their regular customers were simply gone and the markets of Europe had to rebuild themselves from almost nothing. They showed up because they had to, because the town needed them, because without them the market did not function, and without the market the town did not survive. There is something in that I find genuinely moving, though I am not sure I can fully explain why. Maybe it is just the image of it. 3 people in the same square doing 3 completely different things, united by the fact that every person walking through that market needed what they were selling. The bread that kept you going. The fish that the church demanded on days of fasting. The meat that said even if only once a week that you were doing all right. There is one more thing about these 3 trades that I want to leave you with before we move on. They were all passed down, not always from parent to child though often, sometimes from master to apprentice through a formal system of training that could last 7 years before a young person was permitted to practice the trade independently, sometimes through a family arrangement less formal than apprenticeship but just as binding. The baker's daughter grew up watching her father read the weight of a loaf the way other children read letters. The fishmonger's son learned before he could count how to tell a fresh fish from one that had turned. The butcher's apprentice spent years learning which cuts came from which part of which animal, how to work a blade without wasting, how to see a healthy animal from an unhealthy one before it came anywhere near the stall. This knowledge was not written down, not in any form that a person who could not already do the work would find useful. It lived in hands, in eyes, in the particular way someone lifts a fish and knows without thinking whether it is worth anything. Some of that knowledge is gone now. The chain of transmission broke in most places sometime in the last century, when refrigeration and industrial processing and the modern supermarket made it unnecessary. But some of it is still here, in the hands of fishmongers who still operate in the old markets of certain European cities, in bakers who still watch the weight of the loaf with an attention that goes beyond professional habit into something closer to instinct, in butchers who can look at a carcass and tell you things about it that no label could communicate. The work goes on, different now but not entirely unrecognizable. The market is getting noisier. It is mid-morning now in our imagination, and the square is filling up with exactly the kind of people who did not come early, the browsers, the gossipers, the ones who have more time than money and want to see everything before they decide. And there is one section of the market they always stop at longest. Not the fish, not the bread. The cloth. Bolts of wool and linen, and for those who could afford it, silk. Fabric that could make you look like someone different than you were. And behind the counter, far more often than history remembers a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. That story is next. Good evening. Or good middle of the night, depending on when you found your way here. However you arrived, I'm glad you did. There is something about the 5th part of a series that feels different. You are past the beginning, past the novelty of something new, past the point where you are still deciding whether you like this. If you are here now, you have made a real choice. And I find that genuinely moving in the quiet way that some things are. Tonight's story is about fabric. I know how that sounds. Fabric. Not exactly the stuff of high drama. But stay with me, because what I am actually about to tell you is this. There was a section of the old marketplace where more power, more money, more intelligence and more quiet rebellion existed than almost anywhere else in the square. And the people running it more often than history remembers to mention were women. Not as assistants, not as helpers, as the people in charge. Before we go there, a small thing. If you have been listening to this series and something in it has felt like a place you want to return to the market square, these voices, these stories, please share it with someone you think might feel the same way. A like or a subscription is the simplest way to keep these evenings going, and leave a comment when you feel like it. I always read them, and tonight especially tell me if you have ever touched a piece of really old fabric in a museum and felt something you could not quite name. I want to know. Now, pull the blanket up, the cloth quarter is waiting. Stand in the middle of the market square and look toward the section where the awnings are brightest. That is where the cloth is. Not because cloth sellers were vain, though some certainly were, but because the condition of fabric was everything. A bolt of wool that looked washed out in dim light looked completely different in full sun, and a cloth merchant knew that. The best positions in the cloth quarter were the ones that caught the most light. Vendors competed for them, paid more for them, argued about them before the market inspector, and occasionally in front of the town court. The cloth itself, when you got close enough to see it properly, was extraordinary. Wool was the foundation of everything. English wool specifically was considered among the finest in the known world, described by contemporaries as the jewel in the realm, and in the 13th and 14th centuries the towns of Flanders, in what is now Belgium, would pay almost any price to get it. The weavers of Bruges, Ghent and Ypres were the best in Europe, and they needed English raw wool the way a painter needs pigment. Without it, their looms stopped. Without their cloth, the champagne fairs in France lost their most important product. Without the champagne fairs, the entire luxury trade of Northern Europe destabilized. It is not an exaggeration to say that English wool was one of the central economic forces of medieval civilization. The person in charge of the House of Lords in England still sits to this day on something called the wool sack, a large cushion stuffed with wool as a formal reminder of what built England's wealth, and out at the market stall someone was selling it. Here is what the cloth quarter looked like up close. Bolts of fabric stacked on boards and hanging from poles. Wool in every weight and grade, from the coarse brown stuff that most working people actually wore to the finely woven, tightly fulled broadcloth that marked the upper classes. Linen imported from the Low Countries and from France, where the best flax grew. In some stalls, the brighter colours that came from expensive dye stuffs, deep red from madder, and cochineal rich blue from woad, or imported indigo, a yellow-green from weld. And then at the more prestigious end of the section, something that most market-goers could only stop and look at: silk. Medieval silk came from a long way away. China primarily, or the Byzantine workshops that had managed to acquire silkworm cultivation sometime in the 6th century, after, according to a famous story, monks smuggled the eggs out of China, hidden in hollow walking staves. From Byzantium, silk-making spread into the Islamic world and eventually into southern Europe. The silk workshops of Lucca in Italy became famous enough that their products were considered almost their own category of luxury good. By the time a bolt of Chinese or Italian silk reached a market stall in northern Europe, it had crossed deserts and mountains and seas. It had passed through the hands of a dozen different merchants, each taking their percentage, each adding their own costs of transportation and risk. The price it arrived at was genuinely staggering. A length of fine silk could cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in months. A garment made of it was not an item of clothing so much as a portable declaration of wealth. In many medieval markets, silk was not even displayed the way other goods were. It was kept folded, shown carefully handled by the merchant's own hands, before being passed to a customer. You did not browse silk. You were invited to consider it. Sir, now let us talk about the women, because this is where the history gets interesting in a way that is easy to overlook because so little of it was written down by the people who actually lived it. Medieval law across Europe was fundamentally organized around male authority. A married woman in most legal frameworks existed under the economic control of her husband. She could not independently enter contracts, could not sue or be sued in her own name, could not own property separately from her husband. The legal term for this was coverture, the idea that a married woman's legal identity was covered by absorbed into her husband's. But the marketplace created a problem for this tidy theory. The marketplace ran on transactions. dozens, hundreds of them per day made by people who were present, who had goods to sell, who needed to be able to negotiate and receive payment and extend credit in the moment. If every transaction involving a married woman required her husband's formal approval, the whole thing would grind to a halt. Commerce was too fast, too immediate, too real for legal theory to keep up with it, so something practical emerged. In certain English towns, London most notably, but also Bath, Bristol, Lincoln, and others, a system developed that allowed a woman, whether married or single or widowed, to register with the mayor as what was called a femme sole. The term comes from the French, meaning simply sole woman, a woman standing alone operating independently. From the earliest records we have, which appear in London custumals from the 1330s and 1340s, a femme sole had the right to trade goods, to own and sell property, to take civil suits and be taken to court to run her own business, entirely separate from her husband's legal identity. She could be fined, she could go to prison for malpractice or debt. Her husband was not accountable for what she did under this status. That is a striking amount of both freedom and responsibility given what the law said about women everywhere else. And the cloth trade was one of the places where this status mattered most. Let me tell you about the silk women of London. In the 15th century, though, the trade was well established long before that London was the centre of a remarkable female-dominated industry. The women known simply as silk women, or in the spelling of the period, silke women, controlled the processing and sale of silk goods in the city. Not all silk, the great import merchants, were mostly men, but the conversion of raw silk into usable goods, and the retail sale of those goods to the city's wealthy households and to the royal court itself. The work they did was extraordinarily skilled. Silk had to be thrown, that is, the raw thread reeled and twisted into a form that could be woven. The weaving of a narrow silk goods, ribbons, laces, hair, cauls, decorative cords, buttons, tassels, the silk fringes on ceremonial objects required technique that took years to develop. These were not casual workers picking up a skill for a season. These were skilled craftswomen who had trained through a system of apprenticeship that mirrored in practice, if not always in legal form, the guild systems that male trades used. Young girls came from all over England to be apprenticed on Cheapside and Soper Lane, which was the centre of London's Mercery, the district of fabric and silk trading. There is a poem written shortly after the accession of King Edward IV that describes seeing in a summer morning on Cheapside a gentlewoman of Cheapside working on a vestment, a gentlewoman of Cheapside working on an embroidered garment, and finding her so absorbed in her work that the street moved around her like water around a stone. The silk women of London eventually became prominent enough that a statute of King Henry VI formally encouraged the trade as a good occupation for young gentlewomen and other apprentices. The King's Court was a customer. Queens and noble ladies bought their ribbons and silk laces and decorative goods from the silke women of Cheapside. And yet here is the part that I keep coming back to: they never formed a guild. Not because they could not organise, they clearly could. Not because they lacked the numbers or the economic clout, they had both. But because forming an official guild required navigating a legal and political structure that was fundamentally oriented away from them, and because the informal networks of trust and training they had built worked in practice well enough without official recognition, some historians have argued that this was actually a structural vulnerability, that the absence of a guild meant no formal protection, no collective bargaining, no institutional defence against the moment when men decided the silk trade was worth competing in. And that is exactly what eventually happened. Over the following century and a half, men moved into the trade-implemented guild systems and gradually pushed women out. But in those decades, when the silke women ran Cheapside, they ran it as well as anyone. Move now from London to the continent, because the story of women in the cloth trade is not only an English one, In Ghent in Flanders there are records from the town's alderman registers the formal legal records of the city that contain a document from the year 1360. It is a debt acknowledgement. A woman named Caitlin van den Wale, described as a fuller's widow, a fuller being a person who cleaned and thickened woven wool cloth, a skilled and physically demanding trade, had made a significant business deal. She owed almost £5 groot to two other traders for wool she'd purchased. This is a real woman recorded in a real document doing real business in the cloth trade in the 14th century. She is not an exception or an anomaly. The records of Flemish cloth towns are full of similar entries: women buying wool on credit, women selling combed wool from stalls in the cloth halls, wives of merchants completing transactions independently, widows continuing their husbands' operations and doing so well enough that the city's commercial records treated them as significant counterparties. In Arras, in northern France, an ordinance from the Cloth Guild explicitly noted that women sold combed wool for the common profit of the drapery, for the benefit of the entire cloth trade, the ordinance said. They were not tolerated. They were recognised as useful, as necessary even. And in Rouen across the Channel, women held full master status in 7 of the city's 112 guilds as far back as the 13th century. In Cologne, women dominated certain trades outright. The picture that emerges when you look at all of this together is not of medieval women as absent from commerce, or as marginal figures tolerated at the edge of male-dominated trades. It is of women who are present skilled, often indispensable, and operating within systems designed to minimize their formal recognition, while simultaneously depending on their actual labor. That is a complicated thing to sit with. It was a complicated thing to live. Back at the market stall, something quieter. There is a customer arriving. She is perhaps 40 years old, and she has the practical, unhurried air of someone who's been doing this particular errand for many years. She's not wealthy. The fabric she's looking for is wool, not silk, but she's not poor either. She's somewhere in the middle, which in a medieval market meant that she had choices but not unlimited ones. She picks up a length of green-dyed wool cloth and runs her thumb along the weave. Not thinking about it exactly, just feeling. Her hands know what they are looking for, a certain density, a certain smoothness, the absence of loose threads that would mean the fulling had not been done properly. She has made this judgment dozens of times. The woman behind the counter watches. She does not rush, does not offer commentary. This customer knows what she is doing, and interfering with someone who knows what they are doing is one of the fastest ways to lose a sale you already had. After a moment, the customer sets down the green and picks up a piece of russet, a brownish red, and examines it with the same quiet attention. The seller is a widow. Her husband was a cloth merchant who died 3 winters ago. She has been running his stall since then under the femme sole status she registered with the town at the time of his death. The stall was his. The contacts with the wool supplier were his. But the knowledge of cloth, the ability to assess quality, to know which pieces would sell quickly and which would sit until they began to look tired, that was always hers. She had been doing it alongside him for 15 years before she was doing it alone. There is a negotiation that follows. Both women know the price the seller needs. Both know what the buyer can realistically spend. They arrive after some exchange somewhere in the middle of those two numbers. A transaction is made. A length of russet wool changes hands. No record was kept of this. No historian wrote it down. No archive preserves the name of the seller or the buyer or the exact amount paid. But it happened. In 1,000 cloth quarters across medieval Europe on every market day it happened. There is a small thing about the cloth trade that I want to tell you before we leave this section, because it is the kind of detail that does not make it into the broad historical summaries, but that somehow captures something essential. Medieval cloth was not just measured in length, it was measured in quality by feel. There were inspectors, cloth searchers in English towns whose job was to assess whether finished cloth met the standards required for it to be sold at full price. They ran their hands along the surface. They held it up to the light. They pulled at it gently to assess how the threads held under tension. This was not a standardized process in any modern sense. It was not something you could reduce to a checklist. It required a person who had touched enough cloth year after year to understand in their hands what the rules were trying to express. In Ypres in Bruges in Ghent, the cloth halls where finished textile was inspected and approved before sale were enormous, some of the largest and most impressive buildings in any medieval city. The cloth hall of Ypres, completed in the 14th century, was nearly 500 feet long. It still stands today, rebuilt after the First World War. You can walk through it. They built that to grade fabric. Think about what that says about how seriously cloth was taken, about how central the textile trade was to the prosperity of those cities, about how much depended ultimately on the judgment of a person running their hands along a length of woven wool and deciding whether it was good enough. Some of those people were men, some of them almost certainly were women. Their names are mostly gone now, but the buildings they worked in are still standing. The sun is moving higher now in our imagined market square. The cloth quarter has been busy all morning and will be busy until the afternoon light starts to go orange and the sellers begin folding their bolts carefully back onto their boards. But somewhere else in the square, something completely different has been happening all this time. Not quiet, not careful, not precise. Loud, hot, rhythmic. The sound you have been half hearing this whole time, threading through everything else. The clang of metal on metal. The pulse of it, steady as a heartbeat. That sound has its own story. The blacksmith's corner is next. And what happens there is something that the market could not function without and that almost no one ever thought to mention in a history book. Stay with me just a little longer. Hello again. I hope wherever you are is comfortable. I hope the light is low and the air around you has gone quiet the way it does late in the evening when the world starts to slow down, and whatever you were carrying today has loosened its grip just slightly. We have been spending a lot of time in the marketplace together. The smells, the voices, the fish and the bread and the cloth and the women behind the counter who knew more than anyone gave them credit for. And through all of it, underneath all of it, there has been a sound. You might not have noticed it consciously, but it has been there in every part of this series, threading through the background of the square like a second heartbeat. Clang, 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 steady, rhythmic, relentless. Metal on metal from the corner of the market that everyone could hear and nobody particularly looked at. The thing you took for granted, the way you take for granted the sound of your own breathing. Tonight we are going to that corner, and what we're going to find there is stranger and older and more fundamental to human civilization than almost anything else in the square. Before we go, a small pause. If this series has become part of your evenings, if you have found yourself looking forward to this particular kind of quiet, please tell someone about it. A like, a share, a subscription. These are the things that let me keep doing this, and they cost you exactly the 3 seconds it takes to tap a button. Drop a comment too. Tell me what the sound of this is doing to you tonight. I genuinely want to know. Now keep the lights low, follow the sound. The blacksmith's fire was never out, or rather it was never completely out for long. A working smithy kept its forge hot the way a baker kept his oven burning as a professional baseline, a condition of existence. The charcoal that fed it burned hot and long, and the bellows that pumped air into the fire were worked constantly by an apprentice, whose primary job, at least in the early years of training, was exactly that, to pump steadily, without stopping, keeping the temperature where the master needed it. This matters because what happens to iron at different temperatures is not obvious to anyone who has not been taught it, and the teaching took years. At low heat, iron glows a faint, dull red. It is hot enough to burn you badly but not yet workable. At higher temperatures it moves through orange into a brighter yellow. Higher still, and it becomes white, a white so intense that looking directly at it without protection damages the eyes. At that white heat iron flows and yields under the hammer, the way clay yields under hands. The medieval blacksmith read temperature by colour, no thermometer, no gauge, no written scale. Just eyes trained over years to distinguish between a dull cherry red that was useless and a bright yellow-orange that meant the metal was ready, and a white heat that meant you had maybe 30 seconds to do what you needed to do before the iron cooled and you had to put it back in the fire and start again. This was not a skill you could read from a book, because no book could give you what experience gave you the ability to look at a glowing piece of metal and know without thinking whether it was the right colour for the task at hand. Some historians of metal working have described this as synesthetic knowledge, knowledge that lived in the eyes, but that the hands also understood, so that a smith reaching for his hammer was already calibrating for the temperature he had read before his arm had fully extended. This is one of the reasons the smithing guilds guarded their knowledge so fiercely. The guild. Medieval blacksmiths' guilds emerged from the 12th century onward across Europe, and they were, like all guilds, a combination of things that we would now separate into distinct categories: a trade association, a vocational school, a mutual protection society, and crucially a system for controlling who knew what. The guild regulated how many apprentices a master smith could take on, not for charitable reasons but for economic ones. Fewer trained smiths meant less competition, higher prices, greater prestige for those who had made it through the system. Every journeyman who became a master was one more person who could undercut you on price. Every trade secret shared was a competitive advantage lost. So guilds administered by master blacksmiths laid out formal rules about revealing their knowledge to outsiders. Not suggestions rules, with punishments for breaking them. What were these secrets? Some were techniques for quenching the process of cooling heated metal rapidly, by plunging it into water or brine or sometimes oil to change its properties. The speed of quenching, the temperature of the liquid, the angle of entry, all of these affected whether the resulting iron was hard and brittle or strong and flexible. A swordsmith who quenched at the wrong moment produced a blade that shattered under pressure. The right moment required judgment that only experience could provide. Some were secrets about the metal itself, which iron sources produced material that worked better, for which purposes which combinations of hammering and reheating produced specific qualities of strength. Medieval smiths did not understand the metallurgy of carbon and iron in the terms that modern materials scientists use, but they had developed through generations of trial and error an empirical knowledge that was functionally sophisticated, even if theoretically primitive. The colour chart in their heads, the feel of the hammer, the reading of the fire, these were not mystical gifts. They were knowledge accumulated over years which the guild system protected with the same seriousness that a pharmaceutical company now protects a patent. Here is a fact that is worth pausing on for a moment. In the German city of Dinkelsbühl in the year 1387, the city formally granted blacksmiths the right to stand for election to the town council. That is a remarkable thing. Not just that smiths gained political representation, though, that was significant, but that it happened in 1387 specifically after blacksmithing had established itself so thoroughly in the city's commercial life that the people who ran the city could not afford to exclude the people who kept it running. Dinkelsbühl built its wealth on the trade its smiths brought in. Not just the goods they made, but the reputation that good metalwork created the merchants it attracted, the commercial networks it plugged into. The smiths did not just produce tools, they produced prosperity. And by 1387 the city recognized that prosperity with a formal seat at the table There is a pattern here that you see again and again in medieval commerce. The trades that were most essential, most technically demanding, most physically embedded in the basic infrastructure of life, those were the trades that eventually converted economic necessity into political influence. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough that you begin to see the market as something more than a place to buy turnips. It was the arena where economic power became social power, became eventually civic power. But let us go back to the smith himself, the person at the anvil. The word blacksmith has a specific origin that I find satisfying. The black refers to the black layer of iron oxide scale, it is called, that forms on the surface of heated iron as it oxidizes in the fire. Every piece of worked iron came out of the forge with this dark coating. It covered the smith's hands, his apron, his face. He worked in black, literally. And the smith comes from an Old English root meaning simply to strike. The person who strikes the black metal, that is what the word says. And what he made, or she occasionally. A Holcomb Bible picture book from medieval England shows a blacksmith's wife forging nails at the anvil was an astonishing range of objects. Not just weapons, though the popular imagination defaults there. In a market context, the smith made agricultural tools, ploughshares, sickles, scythes, the metal parts of carts and wagons. He made locks and keys, hinges for doors and shutters, hooks, rings, brackets, chains, horseshoes which required their own subspecialty, the farrier, because a horse that threw a shoe mid-journey was a serious problem, and a horseshoe that fit poorly meant an animal that could not work, which in an agricultural economy meant a family that could not eat. He made nails. This sounds small. It is not small. Medieval construction was nail-intensive in ways that are easy to underestimate. Every timber joint, every roof, every platform and stall and cart in the market square needed nails. Each nail was made individually by hand, cut from iron rod, and pointed and headed one at a time. A skilled nailer could produce a significant number in a day. The demand for nails was essentially limitless. In some regions, nails were used as a form of currency. The smith did not just serve the market. He made the market possible. The stall supports were held together by his nails. The cart axles that brought goods to the square had been repaired or replaced in his shop. The scales that the market inspector used to check weights had metal parts that had come from somewhere. The locks on the stalls that vendors shut at the end of the day, his locks, his keys. Everywhere you looked in the square, if you looked for the ironwork, you found him. There was something that surrounded the medieval blacksmith, a quality that people talked about in ways that were sometimes reverent and sometimes uneasy, that had nothing to do with guilds or civic politics. It was the sense that a person who worked with fire and metal was doing something that ordinary people did not fully understand. Every culture that has worked iron has produced myths about the smith. In Greek mythology, Hephaestus was the blacksmith of the gods, divine deformed, capable of creating weapons and armour and living creatures of bronze. In Norse mythology, the master smith Völundr, known in English as Wayland, was a figure so skilled that kings enslaved him to keep his abilities for themselves, and his revenge was so terrible that his captors never recovered. In English folklore, a barrow in Oxfordshire called Wayland's Smithy was said to be the home of an invisible smith who would shoe your horse overnight if you left it there with a silver coin. As recently as the 17th century, people still left coins at that mound. The patron saint of blacksmiths, Saint Eligius, was a 7th century French bishop who had started his career as a goldsmith. The legend that grew up around him, and it is a genuinely strange one, held that he once shoed an unruly horse by cutting off its leg, fitting the horseshoe, while the leg lay on his anvil and then miraculously reattaching it. The image of Eligius holding a severed horse leg over his anvil was a common subject in medieval religious art. It appears in altarpieces, in manuscript illustrations, in carved panels across Europe. I love that image honestly. It says something true about what people thought of blacksmiths, that they operated at a point where the natural and the miraculous blurred, that the things they did making iron yield reading fire by colour, creating tools that made every other trade possible, were close enough to the impossible that the line between craft and miracle was not always clear. The sound of the smithy was, as I said at the beginning, constant, and it carried. In a market square, the blacksmith's sound was one of the few sounds that did not compete with the others. The vendors' calls were a texture of human voice. The animals were noise in a different register. But the hammer on the anvil, that single metallic rhythmic clang, cut through everything. You could hear it at the far end of the square. You could hear it in the streets leading to the square. You could probably hear it on a still morning from the houses on the edge of town. It was not musical exactly. It did not have melody. But it had a steadiness, a pulse that the rest of the market did not have. The calls rose and fell. The animals were erratic. The haggling happened and subsided, but the hammer kept going, steady, present, underneath everything. Some medieval writers describe the sound of a smithy as reassuring. The sign that the town was alive and working, that its fundamental operations were proceeding normally, that the mechanisms of daily life had not broken down. That is a strange kind of comfort. But comfort it was. Ugh. There is a final thing about the smith's relationship to the market that I want to leave you with. Of all the people in the square, the blacksmith was perhaps the one most aware of how everything was connected. He knew because it was his business to know which farmers used which tools. He knew which merchants had horses that needed shoes and how often. He knew the wheel sizes of the main supply carts because he had made or repaired the iron fittings on the axles. He knew which stalls had been built from which lumber because he had driven the nails. He sat at his forge at the edge of the market and watched the whole thing move, and he understood its machinery literally in some cases better than almost anyone in it. The baker worried about the price of grain. The fishmonger worried about the morning tide and the road conditions. The cloth merchant worried about her suppliers in Flanders and her customers in the great houses of the county. Each of them was absorbed in the specific anxiety of their specific trade. The smith, watching from his corner, saw the whole thing. Whether or not he said much about what he saw is another question. Smiths were by reputation, and by the logic of their guild obligations, people who kept secrets. But they were watching. They always were. The fire is still burning in the corner of the square, but the afternoon is coming on, and the light is starting to change. The square is at its fullest right now. Noisiest, most alive, most overwhelming. And somewhere in the middle of that noise, moving through it with a kind of confident purpose that the regular market goers recognized immediately. There are the animals, not just the farm animals we mentioned in passing earlier. The full, chaotic, astonishing variety of things with 4 legs and wings and scales and opinions that ended up in an old marketplace on a busy morning. What happened in the livestock section of a medieval market was its own entire world, one that was messier, louder, stranger, and more surprisingly moving than anything else we've encountered so far. That is where we're going next. You are still here. 7 parts in. That is a real commitment, and I want you to know I do not take it lightly. These evenings we've spent in the marketplace together, I think about them during the day, honestly. I find myself looking at things differently. A butcher's sign, a market stall, the sound of someone calling out a price on a street corner, a small thread of something older running through all of it. Tonight we're going somewhere in the square that smells the worst and sounds the loudest, and is in my opinion the most unexpectedly wonderful. The animals. And I do not just mean the chickens in a crate and the pig on a rope, though yes, those too. I mean the full extraordinary range of creatures that a medieval market might contain on any given morning, from the entirely ordinary to the almost impossibly strange. From the geese walking on tar to the white bird that had crossed half the known world to end up in a nobleman's cage. There is a story here that almost nobody tells, and it starts long before the animal ever reaches the square. A quick pause before we begin. If you are listening to this and enjoying it, if these nights feel like something worth holding on to, please share the series with someone. Tell them there is a quiet place waiting for them here. A subscription, a comment telling me what part of the world you are in right now. These things matter more than you might think, and they help me keep going. Now let us follow the geese. Zestas and brilliant. The geese arrived at the market on foot. This sounds obvious until you think about what it actually means. Geese destined for the market in a medieval town were walked there. Not carried, not transported in cages on a cart, walked. Driven by a goose herd or by the farmer's children or by the farmer herself down the road from the farm into the town, sometimes covering several miles in the early morning hours. And here is the detail that stays with me before the journey: their feet were dipped in tar. The roads in medieval England and France and Germany were not paved in any modern sense. They were mud and gravel and stone, and they were hard on soft feet. A goose walking several miles to market would arrive with damaged, bleeding feet if nothing was done about it. So farmers drove the geese through a shallow tray of warm tar coating the underside of each foot, and sometimes also threw sand afterward to give the tar grip and prevent the birds from slipping. Medieval goose boots, essentially. Disposable, organic, effective. Hundreds of geese walked into market towns on market days. Organised outrage is the best way I can describe the sound of a large flock of geese being herded through a medieval street, each one with opinions about the direction of travel. None of them shy about sharing those opinions. Geese were extremely valuable animals, by the way. Not just for meat, though. Their meat was prized particularly on feast days, but for their feathers, which were used for quill pens and for fletching arrows. The wing feathers of a goose made the best writing instruments available before the modern age. Every letter written by a medieval monk, every legal document signed by a merchant, every poem scratched into parchment by a lovesick knight, all of it written with a feather that had probably started life honking indignantly on a road somewhere. They were also used, according to several medieval agricultural accounts, as watchdogs. Geese, it turns out, are genuinely aggressive and genuinely loud when something unfamiliar approaches. A flock of geese on a farm gave better nighttime security than many dogs. The Roman historian Livy recorded that it was geese who saved the capital in Rome from a Gallic night attack in the 4th century, before the Common Era alerting the garrison when the guards were asleep. Medieval farmers knew this. They used it. Now the pigs. The pigs were not walked on tar. The pigs were simply attached to ropes and escorted more or less with varying degrees of success through the streets on market day. Medieval pigs were not the large docile pink creatures of modern industrial farming. They were closer in appearance and temperament to wild boar, darker, leaner, much harder to manage, and considerably more intelligent than their modern descendants. They had strong opinions about where they were going, and no particular reason to cooperate with anyone who wanted them to go somewhere else. A pig on a rope in a medieval market street was a genuine navigation challenge. The rope had to be held firmly but not so tightly that it pulled the animal into a panic, because a panicked pig in a narrow medieval street was a disaster in the making. You steered, you coaxed, you occasionally just followed wherever the pig decided to go, and hoped it would eventually end up in the livestock section. Town regulations in many medieval cities tried to address the problem of pigs moving freely through market streets. Pigs that escaped from their handlers and wandered the market were, to put it gently, disruptive. They would overturn stalls. They would eat things they were not supposed to eat. They would get into the fish section, which created a particular kind of chaos that I do not think needs further elaboration. Some towns permitted pigs to wander in the early morning hours when the market was still setting up as a practical sanitation measure. pigs being excellent at eating the food waste and refuse that accumulated in a market square. But by the time the trading bell rang and the market officially opened, the wandering pigs were supposed to be controlled. Supposed to be doing a lot of work in that sentence. Or, the horse section was something else entirely. Horses were not sold casually in medieval markets. They were the most valuable animals that most ordinary people would ever buy, and a horse transaction was a serious affair with its own rituals, its own particular body language, its own code of practice that both buyer and seller understood. You looked at the teeth. This is where the phrase "don't look a gift horse in the mouth" comes from, because looking at the teeth was exactly what you did when evaluating a horse for purchase. Teeth grow continuously in horses and wear down at a predictable rate, so the condition and length and pattern of a horse's teeth told an experienced eye roughly how old the animal was. A horse presented as young and vigorous, that turned out on examination to have the teeth of a much older animal, was a horse that had been misrepresented. You were being sold something older, less capable, closer to the end of its working life than you have been led to believe. A gift horse given freely was not something you should interrogate. You accepted it and were grateful. But a horse you were buying with money, you looked in the mouth. You ran your hands along the legs, feeling for swellings, for the heat that indicated inflammation in the joints, for anything that suggested the animal would not hold up under the work you needed it to do. You watched it move, watching the gait for unevenness. You listened to its breathing. This was not a quick transaction. In the horse section of a medieval market, two people could spend the better part of an hour in what appeared to outsiders to be a quiet, almost wordless negotiation, the buyer circling the animal, occasionally stopping to examine something, the seller standing to one side with the careful neutrality of someone who has done this many times and knows that patience is its own form of persuasion. A 2024 study using isotope analysis of horse teeth from a medieval site in Westminster shed remarkable light on how sophisticated this trade actually was. Researchers found evidence that horses in medieval London came from a wide variety of geographic origins, including animals that had been bred on what were likely royal stud farms and sold outward from there. King John in the early 13th century is recorded as having imported 100 Flemish stallions for breeding purposes. The international horse trade was real, was significant, and touched even the ordinary market square where the bloodlines of those imported animals were sometimes visible generations later. Now we come to the part of the livestock section that most people walking through the market would slow down for. Not the geese, not the pigs, not even the horses. The unusual ones, because at larger markets and fairs, and especially at the great annual fairs that were the medieval world's version of a trade expo, animals appeared that had no practical agricultural purpose whatsoever, and that drew crowds of people who had never seen anything like them. Parrots called popinjays in medieval English were known in Europe from ancient times. Alexander the Great had brought green ring-necked parakeets back from India, and the birds had been objects of fascination ever since. By the medieval period, Arab merchants who controlled many of the luxury trade routes between Asia and Europe brought parrots and other exotic birds west, along with their cargoes of spices and silks. A live parrot at a market fair was not common, but it was not impossible. And when one appeared, it became the centre of attention for hours. The most extraordinary documented example of an exotic bird reaching medieval Europe involves a white cockatoo. In the year 1229, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a man famous for his passion for birds and falconry, received as a diplomatic gift from the Sultan of Egypt a white-crested parrot unlike anything most Europeans had ever seen. The bird was depicted 4 times in Frederick's own illustrated manuscript on falconry, which survives in the Vatican Library today. Analysis of those illustrations by modern researchers concluded that the bird was most likely a yellow-crested cockatoo from the islands north of Australia, a bird that had travelled probably in stages over several years from what is now Indonesia or New Guinea, through Malay trade ports across the Indian Ocean, through the Arab merchant networks, and ultimately to the court of a European emperor. The medieval world was more connected than people often realise, and occasionally the evidence of that connection arrived in a cage at a market fair and sat there blinking at the crowd in brilliant white, confounding everyone who looked at it. The assessment of animals at a medieval market was a skilled process, not just for horses, for everything with 4 legs that was going to be purchased and put to work. You pressed your thumbs along a pig's spine to feel whether it was well fed and solid or thin and likely to be disappointing at slaughter. You looked at the whites of a cow's eyes because a healthy cow had clear whites and an unhealthy one did not. You felt a sheep's wool between your fingers not just to assess quality, but to feel the skin beneath, checking for parasites for the rough patches that indicated disease. You listened to the breathing of any animal you were considering because respiratory problems in medieval livestock were common and frequently fatal. This knowledge was passed between farmers at the market, sometimes directly, sometimes by observation. A younger farmer watching an older one work through the assessment of a pig was receiving an informal lesson in practical veterinary science. Not the theoretical kind, but the accumulated empirical kind that has been refined over generations of keeping animals alive through medieval winters. The market was where this knowledge circulated, where the farmer who had learned something useful about identifying a healthy animal from a sick one could inadvertently teach the person standing next to them just by the way they move through the livestock section. There is something I find unexpectedly moving about the livestock section of an old marketplace. It is the most honest part of the market. Everywhere else in the square, things could be misrepresented. Cloth could be mislabeled. Fish could be watered. Bread could be underweight. Coins could be counterfeit. The entire market was in some sense a constant negotiation between appearance and reality, between what things looked like and what they actually were. But an animal was harder to fake. An old horse with doctored teeth eventually gave itself away. A sick pig, no matter how well it had been cleaned up for the market, moved wrong, looked wrong. A thin cow that had been fattened briefly on rich food before the sale would have the skin hanging differently than an animal that had been genuinely well kept all season. The buyers knew this. The sellers knew the buyers knew this. And so the livestock section, with all its noise and smell and chaos, had a baseline of mutual respect for reality that the rest of the market sometimes lacked. You were not selling a story here. You were selling a living thing, and a living thing cannot be made into something it is not for longer than a short while. There is something almost philosophical in that. By midday, the livestock section had reached its peak intensity. The square around it was ankle-deep in evidence of where these animals had stood and what they had done while standing there. The noise had not diminished. The negotiations were ongoing, some of them passionate, some of them silent and careful, some of them ending in handshakes and some of them ending in one party walking away and circling back 20 minutes later with a slightly different offer. A drover who had brought cattle down from Scotland, a journey that might have taken several weeks at the pace of 2 to 3 miles per hour. The animal stopping to graze each night, the drover and his dog sleeping in hedgerows, was finally at the end of that extraordinary journey, standing in the square with his animals and hoping for a fair price. He would go home without them, however the negotiation went. The road back was lighter without the animals, but it was a long road nonetheless. And there were more animals waiting at the farm, and another market day would come eventually, and he would walk the same road again. Boo! The afternoon sun is moving now. The livestock section is beginning to thin out. Animals have been sold, led away by their new owners, starting a new chapter of their lives in a new place. And in the market square, something else is becoming more noticeable. Something that has been here all morning but was easy to overlook in all the noise and activity. The rules that governed all of this. The inspector who walked through and checked the scales. The court that settled disputes before they became fights. The whole invisible legal structure that kept the market from collapsing into exactly the kind of chaos you might expect when you put this many people and animals and transactions into one small space. Because without those rules, the market was just a crowd. And what those rules looked like and what happened to the people who broke them is something that will surprise you. That is what we're exploring next. 8. We've been here 8 evenings together in this market square, and I find myself reluctant to leave it. There is something about returning to the same world night after night that starts to feel like belonging. You begin to notice things you missed the first time. The particular way the morning light hits the stone, the order in which the vendors arrive, the specific quality of the midday noise when the square is at its fullest. If you are new tonight, welcome. Settle in. You can follow this without having heard the rest, though. I think you will want to go back. And if you have been here from the beginning, then you know the square well by now. The sounds and smells, the people behind the stalls, the fish and the bread and the silk and the hammer. Tonight we're looking at something that held all of it together. Something invisible and essential the way a skeleton is invisible and essential. You do not see it, but nothing works without it. The law of the market, and what happened in vivid public, often humiliating detail when someone broke it. Before we begin, one small thing. If these evenings have become part of your routine, if you find yourself looking forward to this particular kind of quiet, I would love for you to hit subscribe or leave a like. It takes a second and it helps more than you might realize. And drop a comment, tell me what part of this series has stayed with you. What detail came back to you at an odd moment during the day. I love hearing those. Now, let the room settle around you. We're going to spend some time with a very small court and its very large authority. Medieval England had many courts. There were royal courts, church courts, manorial courts, borough courts. There were courts for land disputes and courts for criminal matters, and courts for disputes between neighbours over where exactly the fence was supposed to go. And then there was a court that sat in the market. It was called in the French that still shaped English legal language in the medieval period the court of pieds poudrés, dusty feet. In the spelling that English eventually settled on, though calling anything about medieval English spelling settled is generous, it was the pie powder court. The name came from several directions at once, and historians have debated which was the primary source. The most likely explanation is that it referred to the dusty feet of the merchants and travellers who came to market from faraway people who'd walked roads that were in all seasons except summer, made primarily of mud, and who arrived at the fair with their feet thoroughly covered in whatever that road had offered. Travelling merchants, foreigners, the itinerant and the transient, the people who had come from somewhere else, and could not stay long and needed any dispute involving them settled before the day ended. William Blackstone, the 18th century English legal scholar, whose commentaries on the laws of England remain a foundational text for lawyers who read history, described the pie powder court as the lowest, and at the same time the most expeditious court of justice known to the law of England. Lowest in the hierarchy, most expeditious in practice. Those two facts together tell you almost everything you need to know about what made it extraordinary. The problem that the pea powder court solved was specific and urgent. A market attracted people from many places. A large fair attracted people from very far away. Some of those people did not live near the town holding the market. They had travelled days to be there. They had goods to sell and goods to buy and obligations to return home when the market ended. They could not afford to wait weeks or months for a dispute to work its way through the normal legal system, and disputes arose constantly. A merchant claimed he'd been cheated on a sale. A buyer said the cloth he received was not the cloth he had agreed to purchase. Someone accused someone else of selling from an unlicensed spot. Someone's cart had damaged another person's stall. Someone had been pickpocketed and they thought they knew who had done it. The pea powder court had to settle these things fast. In many cases, particularly at major fairs, the court aimed to conclude cases within a single day, sometimes within a few hours. The judges, usually 3 or 4 local men of standing, would hear both sides consider the evidence and issue a ruling before the sun moved too far across the sky. This was unusual. Medieval law was generally slow. It relied heavily on oaths and on producing witnesses who would swear to a person's character or honesty, and all of this took time and negotiation. The pie powder court worked differently, at least in principle. It accepted evidence, it heard argument, it moved. The last active pie powder court in England sat at the Stag and Hounds public house in Bristol. It was formally abolished in 1971 by the Courts Act of that year, but it had not actually heard a case since 1870. The proclamation opening the court, however, was still read aloud in the marketplace of Bristol every year for a century after the last case because nobody had gotten around to officially stopping. There is something almost affectionate about that. A court with no cases still announcing itself out of habit, out of tradition, because the market is open and the market has always had its court, and the words are still known by heart. But the pie powder court was not the only mechanism of market law. For the daily running of a market, the enforcement of weights and measures, the checking of goods, the management of which vendor stood where there was another figure entirely. The clerk of the market. The title tells you something. This was not a ceremonial position. The clerk of the market was an appointed official whose job was to know the rules and enforce them on the ground in the square in real time. In large markets, the clerk of the market of the king's household held authority over prices, weights and measures across markets connected to the royal administration. In smaller local markets, the equivalent figure served the lord or the town council that had granted the market charter. This person walked through the market with standards, literally, standards, physical objects certified by the exchequer or the town representing the official measures, a standard yard, a standard bushel, a standard set of weights. If you were selling by the pound, the clerk could come to your stall, weigh your weights against the standard and determine whether you were giving customers the measure they were paying for. If you were not, it went to the court, or it went directly to the pillory depending on the severity and the local preference for immediacy. The pillory. We have mentioned it in passing in earlier parts of this series, the baker who sold underweight bread, the punishment that was theatrical and public and deliberately uncomfortable. But I want to sit with it properly for a moment because the pillory was not just a punishment. It was a statement about what the market was. The pillory was a wooden frame usually elevated on a platform so the crowd could see it, with holes for the offender's neck and wrists. You bent forward. Your head and hands were locked in place. You could not move freely. You could not shield your face. And the crowd could do whatever it liked. The conventional images involve rotten vegetables, and yes, those were thrown. But so were mud rocks, fish guts, the contents of chamber pots and whatever else. The crowd decided expressed their feelings. People would sometimes organize in advance, making sure to have good throwing material ready for an offender they had particular contempt for. A merchant who had cheated his neighbours for years and finally been caught was not going to have an easy few hours in the pillory. The people he had cheated had been waiting for this. Edward I of England, who reigned from 1272 to 1307, ordered that pillories be constructed to be, and I am quoting from historical records here, sturdy enough to support the human body, which tells you something about the engineering requirements and also about how long offenders were expected to remain in them. The pillory was not just punishment, it was communication. In a society without newspapers, without broadcast media, without any way to widely announce that a particular merchant had been found cheating his customers, public humiliation was the announcement. The whole town and all the market visitors saw it. They understood what it meant. They carried that knowledge home and told people. Word travelled from that platform outward through the county, through the trading networks, through the conversations that happened at the next market and the one after that. A merchant who had spent time in the pillory for fraud did not simply rejoin the market the following week and pretend it had not happened. He had been seen by everyone. The rules themselves were extensive, specific, and occasionally surprising. Markets were only permitted to operate during daylight hours. Trading before the official opening bell was illegal. Trading after the official closing bell was illegal. The specific crime had a name: forestalling, covered buying goods before they reached the official market with the intention of reselling at a higher price. Engrossing covered buying up so much of a single commodity that you could then control its price. Regrating covered buying in one market and immediately reselling in the same or a nearby market for profit. These three things, forestalling, engrossing and regrating, were treated by medieval English law as genuine crimes against the community. The philosophy was clear: the market existed for the public good. Its purpose was to allow producers and consumers to meet and exchange fairly under the supervision of authority. Anyone who tried to manipulate that process for private gain at public expense was not just a cheat. They were a threat to the whole system that everyone depended on. In 1615, the Common Council of London noted with what reads across the centuries as genuine outrage that more deceit is of late used by buying and selling by false weights, beams, balances and scales than ever in any time heretofore hath been practised. The abuses the council declared had caused great defrauding of the king's subjects and the high displeasure of Almighty God. Using a false scale was not just commercial fraud. It was an offence against God. The market was a moral space, and cheating in it was a moral failure. This is not how we tend to talk about markets today, but it was how medieval people thought about them, and it shaped everything about how they were run. Here is something that I find genuinely interesting about medieval market enforcement. The rules about where you could sell were just as strict as the rules about how you sold. The spatial organisation of a market, which we touched on in the very first part of this series, all those evenings ago, was not just practical. It was legal. You were assigned a position, or you claimed one by right of guild or long-standing presence, and selling from outside your assigned area was an offence. A huckster named Sarah Goodwin, her name survives in a London fines record from the late 16th century, was fined for buying in one market to offload in another, which was the specific crime of regrating. She had bought goods cheap in one part of the city's market system and was trying to sell them at a profit in another. This was precisely the kind of private manipulation of the public system that the market laws were designed to prevent. The fine book in which Sarah Goodwin's name appears was kept continuously in London for nearly 40 years, from 1590 to 1628. It recorded hundreds of violations of marketplace rules, selling at illegal venues, using wrong measures, trading at prohibited hours, blocking other vendors selling rotten goods. A complete picture of everything that could go wrong in a market, and what happened to the people who made it go wrong. That document survives. Her name is in it. She was fined. She probably paid and went back to doing what she'd been doing and got caught again at some point, because that is generally how it goes. There was one aspect of market law that I want to linger on because it has a quality that feels different from the rest. The market had a court. The market had an inspector. The market had rules. But it also had something more informal, more immediate, more human. It had collective memory. In a market where the same vendors returned every week for years, for decades, where the same customers came every Wednesday and Saturday, and knew the faces behind every stall. Reputation was a form of enforcement that no official body could replicate. A grain merchant who gave short measure once might not be caught by the clerk of the market that particular day. But the customer who bought from him knew, and the customer told her neighbour, and the neighbour told someone she met at the cloth stalls, and within 2 or 3 market days something had shifted imperceptibly around that grain merchant's stall. A few regular customers had decided to try the other grain seller on the far side of the square. The short measure had cost him not through any court but through the logic of a community that talked to itself. This is one of the things about market history that I think gets lost in the formal records, the regulations we can read, the court cases we can trace. But the vast web of informal knowledge, the shared understanding of who was honest and who was not, the reputation economy that ran alongside the financial one that is almost entirely invisible in the historical record because it was never written down. It existed in conversations, in nods between women at the egg stall, in the way a regular customer would pause just slightly too long before buying from a particular vendor, and the next customer watching would register that pause and file it away. Trust in a medieval market was built slowly and lost quickly, and once lost it was very hard to rebuild in a place where everyone who mattered would remember. There is one final thing I want to tell you about the pie powder court because it is the detail that has stayed with me the longest. When the court was in session, when the market was running and disputes needed resolving, the judges did not sit at a fixed location. They walked. They moved through the market, dust settling on their feet as they went from one end of the square to the other, listening to complaints as they arose, examining the evidence in place rather than calling it to them. They were part of the market, not separate from it. A court that walks, a law that moves through the crowd rather than waiting for the crowd to come to it. There is something in that image that I find unexpectedly beautiful. The idea of justice as a thing that circulates, that is present in the ordinary space of ordinary commerce, that does not require a special building or a formal ceremony to function. 3 or 4 men in the square, feet dusty, listening to whoever needed them to listen, deciding what was fair. That was the market court, and in its way, informal, immediate human scaled, it was more effective for its purpose than almost any formal institution the medieval world possessed. The afternoon is passing now in our imagined square. The court has heard its cases. The inspector has made his rounds. The scales have been checked and the measures verified, and a few people have had a difficult half-hour explaining themselves to people who already had their minds half made up. And somewhere in the crowd, slipping through it lighter on their feet than anyone around them watching the same scene we've been watching, but seeing entirely different things, there are people we've not talked about yet. The pickpockets, the tricksters, the people who looked at all of this careful, regulated, rule-governed commerce and saw opportunity of a different kind. The shadow economy of a medieval marketplace is something that the official records barely touch, which means we have to piece it together from court cases, from literary references, from the occasional complaint that was specific enough to tell us something real. What we find there is stranger, sharper, and more surprisingly relevant than you might expect. That is where we are going next. Oh, you are still here. Come in, make yourself comfortable. This one has been sitting in the back of my mind since we started this series, honestly. The part I've been waiting to get to the shadow running alongside all the honest commerce we have been talking about. Because here is the thing about any place where money changes hands. Any place where people are distracted, where crowds press together, where the noise is too loud to hear clearly, and the movement is too constant to track. Any place like that has always attracted a certain category of person who is watching the whole thing very differently from everyone else. Not thinking about what to buy, thinking about what they can take. Tonight we're going into the shadow economy of the old marketplace. The thieves, the tricksters, the coin clippers, the con men, and the very old, very human truth that the scams they ran in a medieval market square are running in updated form on your phone right now. A small pause before we go there: if this series has become part of your evenings, if you find yourself looking forward to these nights, please share it. A like or a subscription is the simplest way to keep this going, and leave a comment. Tell me what the most surprising thing you have learned in this series so far has been. I read them, and I genuinely love the ones that say, "I never thought about it that way." Drop one tonight. Now, dim the lights a little more. The square is at its midday peak, the noise is at its highest, and somewhere in the crowd something is happening that nobody is supposed to notice. Yeah, the pickpocket did not work alone. This is the first thing that surprises people. There is a mental image of the lone thief, quick fingers, a single decisive moment, a sprint to safety. And while that did happen, the sophisticated version of market theft was a team operation, and it had a structure as organized as anything the guilds could offer. The language that English thieves eventually developed for their own roles is documented in court records and pamphlets from the 16th century onward, and the terms tell you exactly how the system worked. The foist, or file, was the primary thief, the person whose hands actually went into the pocket or cut the purse. The stall was the accomplice, whose job was entirely different: to position themselves near the target, create a physical reason to bump into or crowd the victim, and in that moment of contact and confusion allow the foist to work unseen. And then there was a third person, the Adam Tyler. Their job was the most important of all: to receive the stolen goods the instant they left the target's pocket, before anyone could look back and see them in the foist's hands. By the time a victim reached for their purse and found it gone, the thief who had taken it no longer had it, and the person who had it was already 30 feet away and moving. This was not improvised. It was coordinated, practiced very likely in the way that any skill requiring precision and timing requires practice. There are records of actual schools for pickpockets, organised training operations in London and other cities where boys and young men practiced on coats hung on walls attempting to remove objects without triggering a bell attached to the fabric. You were not considered trained until you could do it without the bell ringing. That was the standard. The market was the preferred operating environment, not because medieval pickpockets were uniquely attracted to markets, but because the market created the perfect conditions: crowds, noise distraction, the sensory overload of dozens of competing stimuli, and people who had come with money and were in the process of spending it, which meant their attention was reliably elsewhere. But outright theft, the lifted purse, the cut cord was only one layer of what happened in the marketplace shadow economy. Some of the more sophisticated operations did not take anything from you without your knowing it. They convinced you to give it over voluntarily. In the late 16th century, a writer and journalist named Robert Greene published a series of pamphlets documenting the world of what he called coney catching. A coney was the Old English word for a rabbit, and a coney catcher was someone who caught them, which in the street slang of the period meant someone who tricked a gullible person out of their money. The rabbit was the victim. The catcher was the con man. Greene wrote his pamphlets as exposés, urgent warnings to honest people who might be taken in, but they read 5 centuries later like a field guide to fraud. Every trick he describes in a 16th century London market has a direct equivalent in modern life. The basic coney catching operation worked like this. The victim was identified, usually someone who'd come to the city from the countryside, unfamiliar with the pace and the faces slightly overwhelmed, carrying visibly more money than they were used to managing. The con man, or more often a team of them, would introduce themselves as friends, as locals with inside knowledge, as people who knew how things worked and wanted to help. They might suggest a game of cards or dice entirely for fun, no money involved. Then money got involved gradually. Then the game turned in ways the victim did not fully understand, because the game had been set from the start to turn that way. By the time the victim realised what was happening, they were already several transactions deep, and their options were limited. Green describes a country farmer walking through London, money in his round-sloped pocket, hand pressed over it protectively, clearly wary. He survives the first approach, the second, the third, but eventually someone finds the angle that works. There was always an angle that worked. The coney catchers were professionals, the farmers were not. What I find striking about these accounts, and this is the part that stays with me, is how little the fundamental mechanics have changed. The distraction and extraction model of the pickpocket is the same model used by phishing emails. Get the target's attention on something slightly alarming, something that requires immediate response, something that makes them not notice what is actually happening. The hand in the pocket, the cursor on the link, structurally identical. The coney-catching con, the friendly stranger with insider knowledge, the game that seems fair until it suddenly is not, is the same model used by every investment fraud ever perpetrated, including the ones you read about in the news last week. The people in the medieval market were not more naive than we are. They were dealing with the same human instincts being exploited by the same techniques. The costume has changed. The setting has changed. The technology has changed. The underlying architecture of deception has not. Now, there was a crime in the medieval marketplace that was different from pickpocketing and from coney catching, and it is one that I want to spend some time on because it gets at something fundamental about how medieval commerce actually worked. Coin fraud. In the modern world, all your transactions are verified automatically and instantly. If you hand over a $20 bill, the machine knows it is real or it does not. If you pay with a card, the number either clears or it does not. The system does the verification for you. In a medieval market, you were on your own. There were multiple currencies circulating simultaneously in most English and European markets. English pennies, yes, but also coins from France, from Flanders, from other parts of the continent, all of different metals, different weights, different degrees of trustworthiness depending on where they'd been minted and by whom. A foreign merchant might legitimately present you with coins you'd never seen before and could not easily assess. And into that genuine complexity the coin fraudsters inserted their operations. The most basic form was clipping. Medieval coins were hand-struck, which meant their edges were irregular. No two coins were exactly the same shape. A clipped coin, one from which a tiny amount of precious metal had been shaved from the edge, looked essentially like a normal coin in casual handling. You felt it, glanced at it, accepted it. The clipped metal was then collected, melted down, and either sold as bullion or used to make more coins themselves, slightly underweight, slightly fraudulent, entering circulation and degrading the money supply one shaved edge at a time. By the 17th century, though, the practice was well established much earlier. It was estimated that 1 in 10 British coins in circulation was counterfeit, and the weight of properly minted money had fallen to half the legal standard. 1 in 10. Think about what that means for every transaction in every market in England. You had roughly a 10% chance on any given purchase that the coin you were handing over or receiving was not what it appeared to be. King Edward I of England, who reigned from 1272 to 1307, was so alarmed by the prevalence of clipped and counterfeit coinage that he launched a major investigation and eventually a series of prosecutions that became one of the most controversial episodes in English medieval history. The consequences fell disproportionately on a particular community, and unjustly so in many cases, but the underlying problem was real and economically damaging. Coin clipping was not a minor crime. It was treated as treason. It was considered by medieval legal and moral thinking as damage to the body of the king himself, whose image appeared on every coin. Damaging a coin was damaging the king. That is how seriously this was taken, and yet it continued. Because it was profitable, and because in a crowded, noisy market nobody had time to weigh every coin they received. Beyond the thieves and the coin clippers, there was a third category of shadow economy, participant in the medieval market. One who did not technically steal anything, and who did not pass counterfeit money. They just sold things that were not what they said they were. There was in late medieval and Tudor England a thriving trade in fake relics. Bones of saints, fragments of the true cross vials of holy water from Jerusalem, objects that carried religious significance, and that if genuine could bring spiritual protection and healing to the buyer. The market for relics was enormous because the religious framework of medieval life made them genuinely valuable to people who believed in them, and so there was a corresponding supply of manufactured ones, a bone from a local butcher's shop, a wood chip from any convenient tree, a vial of ordinary water. These objects placed in the right container, accompanied by the right story, sold to the right buyer at the right moment, became relics. The transaction was technically voluntary. The buyer got an object, the seller got money, nobody's pocket was picked, but someone went home believing they had purchased something holy. In the 14th century, Geoffrey Chaucer described in the Canterbury Tales a pardoner, a man who sold pardons and relics, who explains quite openly to his fellow pilgrims how his business works. He knows his relics are fraudulent. He sells them anyway. He tells us this with the cheerful frankness of someone who's made his peace with what he does, and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. Thus can I preach again that very vice / which I myself practice, which is avarice. He is not a sympathetic character, but he is a recognizable one. Every age has a version of him. Here is what strikes me about all of this. The shadow economy of the market was not separate from the legitimate economy. It lived inside it, fed off it, needed it. The pickpocket needed the crowd. The coin clipper needed the circulation of genuine money. The coney catcher needed the honest merchant's market to exist as a reference point. The legitimacy of real commerce gave his fake version plausibility. The relic seller needed the genuine faith of the people around him to make his product feel worth buying. None of them could have existed in isolation. They were parasites on the real market in the biological sense, organisms that live on and within a host without necessarily killing it, taking what they need from the system they inhabit. The market authorities understood this, which is why market law was so concerned not just with catching individual thieves, but with maintaining the overall system of trust that made commerce possible. The pie powder courts, the market inspector, the pillory for dishonest traders. All of these were responses not just to individual crimes, but to the threat that dishonesty posed to the entire enterprise. If you could not trust the coin you received, you were less willing to make transactions. If you could not trust the goods you were sold, you were more cautious, slower, less willing to do business with strangers. Every successful fraud in a medieval market made that market slightly less functional for everyone. The con man who walked away with his purse full left behind a market that was by one tiny increment a little more suspicious, a little more guarded, a little more expensive to operate in. Trust, it turns out, has a price, and when it degrades, everyone pays. The afternoon shadows are lengthening now in our imagined square. The pickpockets have done their best work. The noon crush has been the richest period, as it always is. Some of them have succeeded. Some have been caught and are about to have a very unpleasant encounter with the market court. And now a different kind of person is moving through the square. Someone who does not fit any category we have met yet. Not from the town, not a regular customer. The cut of their clothes is different. The language they use has a different rhythm. They carry something unusual, something that nobody in this market has seen before, and they are looking for someone willing to pay for it. The stranger in the market. In the next part, we're going to follow them. The travellers, the merchants from far away, the pilgrims and the outcasts, the people who arrive from somewhere most of us could not name on a map. And what they brought with them beyond their goods that changed the markets they passed through forever. That story is next. Hello, 10 evenings, 10 returns to this square, this noise, this world of voices and mud and fire and bread. I hope it has become something you look forward to. I hope somewhere in these parts you have found a person, or a moment or a detail that stuck with you past the listening. Tonight we're going to talk about the people who did not belong here, not the regulars, not the vendors who came every week, the customers who knew which stall had the best eggs, the market inspector who had walked this square so many times he could navigate it with his eyes shut. Not any of those people. We're going to talk about the person who appeared in the square and nobody knew their face. The stranger. And the strange thing about strangers in a medieval market is this. They were simultaneously the most distrusted people in the square and the most anticipated. Nobody was more welcome. Nobody was more closely watched, because the stranger carried something the regulars could not provide, everything the locals had never seen before. A small pause. If these nights have become something meaningful to you, please share them. A subscription, a comment tonight just telling me where in the world you are and what time it is. These small things keep this going more than you might realize. They mean something real to me. And if you have been saving a hello for the right moment, this one might be it. Now let the lights go low. There is a stranger entering the market and we are going to follow them from the gate. The medieval world was not as isolated as it is often portrayed. This is one of the most persistent misconceptions about the Middle Ages, the idea that people stayed put, that travel was rare and dangerous, that the world beyond the next village was essentially unknown. Some of this was true in some places at some times, but the marketplace told a different story. The market, by its very nature, drew people from distances, and the larger the market, the greater the distances. There is a record from 1315, a dispute over toll payments in which a merchant from London was stopped at the town of Sandwich, 63 miles away. He'd been carrying almonds, figs and raisins. Those goods had not been grown in England. They had come from somewhere warmer, somewhere far to the south, and they had passed through multiple hands before ending up in a London merchant's cart on its way to a market where they would change hands again. That is not isolation. That is a supply chain. And the people who moved along those chains were not abstractions. They were individuals with names and histories and specific knowledge of the world that most market-goers would never accumulate in a lifetime of staying home. When they arrived in the square, they brought more than their goods. They brought news. In a world without newspapers, without printed broadsheets, without any systematic way of distributing information across distance, the travelling merchant was the living news system. If you wanted to know what was happening in another city, you waited for someone who had been there. A merchant who had passed through Paris on his way to London could tell you about the mood there, about the state of the roads, about whether there had been flooding or fever or military movement that might affect supply lines. A pilgrim returning from Rome had seen what the papal court looked like, what the weather had been, whether the roads were safe or whether bandits was inactive on a particular stretch. This information was genuinely valuable, not just interesting valuable, it affected decisions. A cloth merchant who knew that there had been a crop failure in Flanders learned from a travelling wool buyer who'd just come from there could adjust what he paid for his raw materials before that information reached anyone else in the market. The stranger's knowledge was an economic asset, and so the stranger was treated with a particular kind of hospitality that had an edge of calculation to it. You offered them a seat, a cup of ale, a moment of warmth, partly because that was simply courtesy, and partly because you wanted to hear what they had seen. The innkeeper's interest in travellers was not only commercial, it was informational. Every night's lodger was a potential source of intelligence about the outside world. Some travellers were permanent features of the trade routes that connected medieval Europe. The Hanseatic League merchants deserve a mention here because they represent perhaps the most organised version of what a travelling merchant community looked like at the height of the medieval period. The League began in the late 12th century as a loose association of German merchants who needed to protect their trade in the Baltic and North Sea. Over the following 2 centuries it grew into something extraordinary, a network that ultimately included somewhere between 70 and 200 cities stretching from England in the west to Novgorod in Russia in the northeast. Not a country, not a government exactly, something more like a corporation that had its own navy, its own courts, its own diplomatic relationships with kings, and its own permanent trading stations called contours in foreign cities. In London, the Hanseatic contour was called the Steelyard. It operated for roughly 4 centuries from around 1170 to 1598, when Queen Elizabeth I finally revoked its special trading privileges. That is a 400-year presence of a community of foreign merchants operating their own legal enclave within an English city, trading goods that English merchants could not always match, and under terms that gave them significant commercial advantages. The Steelyard merchants brought salted fish from Bergen Amber and furs from the Baltic, grain and timber from the eastern ports. They spoke German, they operated by different legal customs, they maintained their own community within the city. They were strangers who had become, through sheer persistence and economic indispensability, a permanent part of the landscape. When one of them appeared at an English market fair, they were known quantities. Not unknown strangers so much as foreign regulars, people whose goods and methods were understood even if their language was not. But not all the strangers in a medieval market were merchants from organised trading networks. Some of them were pilgrims. Pilgrimage was a massive phenomenon in medieval Europe. The shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury was one of the most visited sites in Christendom. Records show pilgrims arriving not just from across England, from France, Germany, Italy, Iceland, Hungary. There are even records of pilgrims coming from as far as India. Canterbury lay on the main road between London and the major seaports of Sandwich and Dover, and important visitors coming from the continent would stop at the shrine before continuing to London. Geoffrey Chaucer understood this perfectly. The Canterbury Tales, written between 1387 and 1400, assembles its storytellers specifically because a pilgrimage was one of the very few situations in medieval life where people of radically different social classes could be found moving together in the same direction at the same time. A knight, a prioress, a monk, a merchant, a humble ploughman, a miller, a widow from Bath who'd been on multiple pilgrimages, none of these people would have found themselves sharing a road under other circumstances. Pilgrimage was a temporary dissolving of the usual social boundaries, and the marketplace along the route was where that mixed company stopped and spent money and left traces of its passage. A pilgrim was easy to identify in a market town. The pilgrim's badge, a small tin or lead souvenir purchased at a major shrine, was worn visibly, sometimes several of them sewn onto a hat or cloak to indicate how many pilgrimages had been completed. A person wearing the scallop shell of St. James at Compostela in Spain was someone who had walked or ridden several hundred miles and could tell you something about the roads between here and there that you would find very hard to verify any other way. The pilgrim's badge was the medieval equivalent of a passport stamp, a visible record of distance travelled, of worlds seen. And then there were the people whose presence in the market was more complex. The Jewish community in medieval England and across much of medieval Europe occupied a position that was both essential and precarious. Jewish moneylenders and merchants provided financial services that the Church's prohibition on usury largely prevented Christians from offering formally. They held the mechanisms of credit and money exchange that made long-distance trade possible at a scale the economy required. By the 12th century, Jewish communities had spread from London to 11 major English cities, primarily the major trading hubs in the east of England. The Jewish community at York lent extensively to fund the Cistercian monastery's acquisition of land. In Windsor, travelling Jewish merchants made regular visits, even though permanent settlement was smaller there. The word bank incidentally derives from the Italian word for the tables at which money lenders and currency exchangers sat in the marketplace. Banking was market activity quite literally. The table in the square was the bank, but the position of Jewish traders in the medieval marketplace was maintained on terms that were never secure. They could trade, they could provide essential financial services, they could appear in the market square and conduct business there, and they were subject to regulations, to restrictions on where they could live, to sudden shifts in political tolerance that had nothing to do with their commercial conduct. In 1290, the entire Jewish community was expelled from England in an act that severed the financial networks those communities had built over centuries. The market lost something it would not fully replace for generations. The stranger in the market was sometimes welcome, sometimes tolerated, sometimes expelled without warning. The rules about who could stand in the square and what they could sell and who could refuse them were not always written down, and not always consistent and not always fair. Zarela, what did the stranger bring to the market beyond their goods and their news? Something less tangible, something that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. They brought evidence that the world was larger than the square. For a farmer who had never travelled more than 20 miles from the village where she was born, the appearance of a merchant from the Baltic coast, with his unfamiliar accent, his goods wrapped in ways she had never seen, his casual references to places that existed for her only as names heard in church or whispered in stories, was a reminder that the world extended in all directions beyond the horizon she could see. This is not a small thing. It is easy to underestimate how thoroughly ordinary medieval life was bounded by the immediately local. Not because people were incurious or intellectually limited, they were not, but because the physical experience of distance was so demanding that most people simply did not travel very far very often. The market was for many of them the furthest boundary of their regular world, and the stranger crossed that boundary and came in from the other side. He brought salt from Biscay. She brought silk that had passed through Constantinople. He brought news of flooding in Flanders and the smell of a sea most of his audience would never see. She brought amber from the Baltic coast of a country she called by a name that sounded like something from a dream. The world arrived in the square, carried in on the dusty feet of people who had walked it, and the people of the square received it with the mixture of wonder and wariness that human beings have always brought to the experience of encountering what they do not know. Yes, there is one final thing about the stranger in the market that I want to leave you with. Strangeness was not only a liability, it was in some circumstances a commercial asset. Historians studying medieval trade have noted that communities with reputations as skilled foreign merchants, who were known to travel widely to deal in multiple currencies, to have contacts across distant cities, could command trust precisely because of their foreignness. Being unknown locally meant being known elsewhere. It meant having a network that extended beyond what local merchants could access. It meant being able to obtain goods that the local market could not source. The stranger's outsider status, which made them an object of suspicion at the gate, became a form of credibility at the stall. They had come from somewhere. They had seen things. They could get things. In the right context, there was no better advertisement than that. The afternoon is deepening now in the square. The strangers have made their sales and their purchases. Some of them will spend the night in town at an inn where the host will draw them out over supper, asking about the roads and the prices and the news from wherever they have come from. Some of them will move on before dark, following a road that leads somewhere none of the townspeople around them have ever been. They carry the market with them as they go. The price of wool here, the state of the fishing in the north, the name of a woman at a cloth stall who knows her fabric better than anyone in the county. Information moving through a world that has no other way to move it. And in the square, what's left behind after the strangers leave is a slightly changed community. A few more facts about the world. A few stories that will be told at supper tonight and remembered for years. A market is not just a place of exchange. It is a place where the world touches itself. Where what happens far away becomes for a moment present in a square, in an English town on a Wednesday morning. The day is almost done now. The strangers have gone. The vendors are beginning to think about closing. The animals that were not sold are being led back toward the farms they came from. But there is one part of this world we have not fully entered yet. One story that has been sitting at the edge of the square all day waiting. What does the marketplace look like when it empties? When the noise fades and the people scatter and the square becomes once more an open space under the sky, what is left behind? Who are the last people there? What do they find in the silence? And what does it mean that a place this alive, this crowded, this overwhelming becomes every week completely quiet again? The closing of the market is next, and it is the part of this story that surprised me most. Here we are, part 11. I want to say something before we begin tonight, and I hope it does not feel strange to hear. This has been one of the most meaningful series I have made. Not because of any particular episode, not because of one detail or discovery, but because of the cumulative effect of spending this much time in one place. Returning again and again to the same square, learning it gradually. I think the marketplace taught me something that I did not expect. It taught me how much happens in the ordinary, not in battles or coronations, not in the decisions of kings. In a cold Wednesday morning when a fishmonger arranges his stall before sunrise, and a farmer walks 5 miles with his geese, and a cloth merchant checks the light on a bolt of wool, and somebody's purse quietly changes hands. That is where most of life actually happens, and it is extraordinary. Tonight we are watching it end. The bell has rung. The market day is over. And what happens next is something I have been thinking about since we started this series. Before the square goes quiet, if you have been here for this whole journey, please let me know. Just leave a comment tonight. Tell me which part surprised you most or which person you found yourself thinking about after you stopped listening. Those comments mean more to me than anything. And if you have not yet subscribed, this will be the perfect moment. You will not regret it. Now, let the room get very quiet. The closing bell has just rung in the market square. Listen. It did not happen all at once. That is the first thing you would notice watching a medieval market close from somewhere above the square, a window perhaps in one of the tall, narrow buildings that lined the edges. The closing bell rang, and the market did not simply stop. It exhaled. Gradually, unevenly. The fish sellers had already gone. They had been the first to arrive and the first to leave by midday at the latest, often earlier, because their goods made the decision for them. The fish section of the square had been the busiest between 7 and 11 in the morning, and largely empty by the time the afternoon sun started its descent. If you arrived at the fish stalls in the mid-afternoon, you found boards being wiped down and buckets being rinsed, the smell still very much present even after the product was gone. The bread sellers lingered a little longer. Bread could be held through the day in a way that fish could not. But by early afternoon the prime loaves had sold, and what remained was the end-of-day bread, still edible, still worth taking home, but no longer the fresh-from-the-oven item that had drawn people in that morning. The price dropped as the afternoon wore on. This was not a formal price adjustment, just the practical reality of a vendor who wanted to carry as little home as possible. A loaf of bread is heavy, a coin is not. The cloth merchants were often the last to leave, or among the last. Cloth did not spoil. A bolt of fabric that had not sold today could be stored, rolled and wrapped and stacked in the upper room of the market hall, and brought back out next Wednesday. There was no urgency in the cloth quarter's closing rituals, just the careful folding. the methodical rolling the precise way that an experienced trader wraps a bolt to protect it through the days between market days. And then there was the square itself. Once the stalls began to come down, the true face of a market day revealed itself, the evidence. The ground of a busy medieval market square by mid-afternoon was a record of everything that had happened there since dawn. Scattered straw from the livestock section, vegetable leaves and the occasional root dropped by a customer who did not notice, fish scales near the eastern edge embedded in the mud, the dark patches near the butcher's area that told you without ambiguity what had taken place there, broken pottery shards where a jar had slipped and shattered, a single lost button, and coins, almost always scattered coins. Not many. The market was a place where money was handled with great care, and people were generally attentive to what they dropped. But in a busy morning of hundreds of transactions, in the crush of a crowd, in the moments when a purse was hastily opened and a hand moved quickly to receive change, sometimes a coin fell and was not recovered, slipped into a gap between stones, kicked sideways by a passing foot, fallen into the loose straw and missed in the confusion. The children knew about this. There is a reason that children appear in multiple historical accounts of medieval market days as a persistent feature of the late afternoon square. They were not there accidentally. They had learned from their parents, from older children, from the accumulated knowledge of living near a market that the hour after the stalls came down was the hour of possibility. Small hands could reach into the gaps between cobblestones where adult fingers could not fit easily. Eyes close to the ground spotted what feet had kicked aside. A child who found a coin in the market square after closing had found something real, something that changed what was available for supper that night. The dogs came too. Medieval towns had dogs in the way medieval towns had mud and smoke as a permanent condition of the environment taken for granted by people who lived there, but striking to anyone who came from somewhere that managed these things differently. Dogs were working animals, mostly herding dogs, hunting dogs, dogs who guarded the grain stores. But there were also the dogs that simply lived near the food supply that a market represented, and who had learned across generations of urban dog life that market closing time was their best opportunity. They came for the offal and the scraps and the dropped food and the trampled vegetables. They came quietly, not a pack, not a rush, just individual animals drifting into the square with the casual confidence of creatures who understood that the humans with the sticks had mostly gone home. Historical accounts of medieval markets describe this aftermath with matter-of-fact brevity. The square was cleaned, the market regulations required it, but in the time between the closing bell and the cleaning, the square was briefly left to those who came after. The dogs, the birds, the children, the people who had not been able to afford anything during the market hours, and who hoped to find something worth taking in what was left behind. This was not a comfortable image. It is also a true one. The market was an engine of commerce, and like all engines it produced waste, and that waste had its own economy, and the bottom of that economy was occupied by people who could not participate in the main event. Yes, the vendors who had sold well spent the closing hour counting. This sounds simple, it was not. Medieval currency was complicated in ways that modern people find difficult to intuit. Multiple denominations, multiple origins, multiple metals, all circulating simultaneously. A successful morning's trading might have left a vendor with a collection of coins from several different kingdoms and of varying actual value. The counting was not simply arithmetic, it required assessment. Which of these coins was clipped? Which was foreign, and therefore needed to be evaluated against the local standard, which could be spent at face value and which would be questioned. The inn near the market was where many of this accounting happened, because the alehouse and the inn served a function that is easy to overlook when we think about medieval commerce. They were the settlement layer. the place where the day's transactions were reviewed, where deals made in haste during the market rush were confirmed or disputed, where merchants who had agreed to terms but not finalized payment met their counterparts to close the transaction properly. It was also where the news of the day circulated, what had sold and what had not, who had brought goods to market that people were not expecting, who had offered a price that seemed either very generous or very suspicious, whether the quality of the fish had been acceptable or whether people had complained, which vendor had been approached by the market inspector, and whether anything had come of it. The inn was the market's debrief, a daily audit conducted over ale in overlapping conversations that you could not really follow if you were only listening to one of them at a time, but that collectively formed a picture of the day's economy more complete than any official record. Information moved through those rooms the way blood moves through a body, steadily, continuously, in every direction at once. Instead, some vendors did not go to the inn. They went home, and the journey home was often as long as the journey in had been. The farmer who had walked 5 miles at 2 a.m. with a cart of turnips walked 5 miles back in the late afternoon, the cart lighter, or empty, or carrying the few unsold items she had decided were worth taking home rather than discounting. The road back was quieter than the road in. The pre-dawn energy of the outward journey, the anticipation, the planning, the quiet excitement of market day had been replaced by the steady tiredness of a day's work done. Along with coins earned on the trade and whatever good she might have purchased, she carried something else home, something that travelled back into the rural areas along every road that led away from a market town at the end of every market day across the entire medieval period. News, information, cultural practice, small adjustments to the mental map of the world. A woman who went to market on Wednesday came home knowing something she had not known on Tuesday. About prices in a neighbouring town, about the health of a trade partner, about new technique one of the other cheese sellers had mentioned for preserving curds through winter, about the rumour that was circulating regarding the state of the roads to the north. Historians studying this phenomenon have described it as the market's secondary function, its role as an information distribution network that touched every person who participated in it and carried what they learned back to wherever they had come from. The goods moved one direction. The knowledge moved in all directions, simultaneously radiating outward from every market in every direction, at walking pace along every road that led away from the square. What we would now call a network. What medieval people simply called going to market. By evening the square was empty, or nearly so. Someone was sweeping. Probably the market regulations required that the square be cleaned after trading, and somebody's job it was to do this. The straw went into piles. The broken things were gathered. The channels where liquid waste had been directed were cleared, and then the square was just a square again, open, stone-paved or mud-packed depending on the town's wealth and the season. The market cross standing in the centre, cold in the evening air. The arcades where the stalls had been arranged now empty columns of shadow. The church bell tower at one end silent since the closing ring. You could walk through it now and hear nothing but your own footsteps. That silence, after what had been happening there since 2 a.m, had a specific quality. Not just quiet, but the particular quiet that follows a great deal of noise. The kind of silence that still has the shape of what came before it. I think about that silence a lot. A place that has been the most alive thing for miles around the centre of commerce, of argument, of news, of justice, of community, of fraud and honesty and hunger and abundance, becomes in the space of a few hours nothing but an empty square. And then in 5 days or 2 days, depending on the town and the charter, it will fill again, exactly like this. The same people in the same positions, the same sounds starting before dawn, the same bell ringing at the same hour. The market does not end, it only pauses. I've been thinking about what to call this series. what the old marketplace actually is at its core, what it represents beyond the obvious, and I keep arriving at the same answer. It is a recurring human need made visible, the need to come together, the need to exchange not just goods but information, contact, news, the simple reassurance that other people exist and are managing, and that the world outside the farm or the workshop or the house is still functioning. The need to be for a few hours each week part of something larger than the immediate life. Markets are one of the oldest continuously repeated human activities. They predate every political system that has ever tried to regulate them. They survived the fall of Rome. They survived the plague. They adapted to every technology and every currency and every change in what people needed and how they moved. The square goes quiet in the evening, and 5 days later, before anyone in the town is awake, someone is setting up a stall in the dark. We are almost at the end of this journey. There is one more evening in the marketplace, one final visit to the square, and it is the most philosophical one, the one I have been building toward across all of these parts, whether I knew it at the time or not. What does it mean that the old marketplace is gone? Not the physical space, many of those squares still exist. You can stand in the shambles in York, in the Grand Place in Brussels, in 100 market squares across England and France and Germany and the Netherlands, and feel the shape of what used to happen there. But the marketplace as it was, as a living, necessary, irreplaceable centre of community and commerce and information and justice, that is gone. Or is it? Because I've been thinking about your phone, about your screen, about the place where you go to get the information you need and make the exchanges that matter and hear the voices of strangers from places you have never been. The final question is whether the old marketplace has truly disappeared or whether it has simply changed its shape so completely that we've stopped recognizing it. That is the last conversation, and it is one I have been looking forward to from the very beginning. Stay with me for one more evening. You made it. 12 evenings, 12 returns to the same square, and now we've arrived at the last one. I want to start by saying something that might sound strange, but I mean it completely. Thank you. Not in the reflexive way, in the real way. You chose 12 times to spend your last waking hour in a medieval market square that smelled of fish and wood smoke, and the work of people who have been dead for 600 years. You found that worth your time. I find that remarkable and genuinely moving. Tonight is different from the others. Tonight we are not going back into the market. We're standing at the edge of it looking at what remains, and then we're going to ask the question that has been sitting quietly at the centre of this entire series from the very first morning when the fishmonger arrived before dawn. Where did the market go? And the answer, I think you are going to find it both strange and familiar. One last invitation before we begin. If this series has meant something to you, please leave a comment tonight. Not just a quick one, really tell me something. Tell me which evening surprised you most. Tell me which person in the square you found yourself thinking about at a random moment during your week. Tell me if you are going to look at farmers' markets differently now, or market squares when you travel, or even Amazon differently. Those thoughts, those specific, genuine, personal responses are the reason to keep making things like this. And if you have not yet subscribed, this is the night. Not because I am asking, but because you have been here 12 times, which means you already know you want to come back. Now, sit with me in this last quiet moment. The marketplace as medieval Europe knew it did not disappear overnight. It faded. Slowly, unevenly, in the way that most profound changes happen, not with a dramatic ending, but with a gradual drift. A series of small replacements, each individually reasonable, that added up over decades to something fundamental being gone. The first shift came with refrigeration. Not all at once, refrigeration entered commercial food distribution in stages across the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But its effect on the market was quiet and decisive. The urgency that had governed market commerce for 1,000 years the absolute necessity of selling perishable food before it became worthless, the reason the fishmonger arrived before dawn and was gone by noon, the reason bread prices dropped through the afternoon that urgency began to dissolve. When you could store food without it turning the compressed time pressure of the market day relaxed. Goods could be held, sold later, distributed through shops rather than concentrating in a square on 2 days a week. The railroad accelerated this. Refrigerated rail cars meant that the fish, arriving at a market, no longer came from a boat at a nearby port. It could come from hundreds of miles away, transported overnight, arriving fresh enough to sit in a case for days. The ripier who had ridden through the night on a horse from the south coast became unnecessary. A canning plant in a northern city replaced him, and then the supermarket. The first self-service grocery stores appeared in the United States in the late 1920s. Supermarkets with discounts followed in the 1930s. By the mid-20th century, the supermarket had won. Not through any single dramatic victory, but by offering something the old market could not match: fixed prices, predictable stock, and the ability to do everything in one place, without negotiating, without noise, without the need to know the difference between a good egg and a bad one. Pike Place Market in Seattle. One of the most beloved public markets in America nearly closed in the 1960s when developers planned to demolish it and replace it with office towers. The farmers who had sold there for decades were being bought out. The stalls were emptying. The market's buildings were crumbling. A grassroots citizens group formed to save it, led by an architect named Victor Steinbruch. He wrote at the time that the quality of life in American cities had eroded grievously, and that the market represented something cities were losing that they did not yet know they could not live without. He was right. The market was saved. It still stands, and it is still one of the most visited places in the Pacific Northwest. But most did not get saved. Most of what the medieval market was quietly disappeared. Here is what I have been thinking about, and I want to share it carefully because I think it is important. When the market went away, the physical gathering, the weekly coming together, the shared space where commerce and community and justice and information were all conducted in the same square, something specific was lost. Not just a place, a function. The marketplace was, as we have seen across these 12 evenings, never only about buying and selling. It was where you found out what was happening, where disputes were settled, where the stranger from far away arrived, and the news from that far place arrived with them, where the person who had been cheating his neighbours finally had to face the crowd, where a woman with a cloth stall built a life on her own terms in a world that had few other spaces for that, where children learned about the value of coins by watching adults negotiate over them, where the whole community gathered around its most basic need: food, shelter, tools, cloth, and in doing so, found out who it was. Take the buying and selling away and you still have something essential. Put the buying and selling online in a warehouse fulfillment system in a sealed package delivered to a door, and you have kept the transaction but lost everything that surrounded it. And now I want to ask you to think about something. Where do you get your news? Not the formal news, the informal kind. The kind that tells you what is actually happening in the world you care about, the price of things, what people think about those prices, what is available that was not available last month, what someone you respect recommends, what someone you do not trust is selling, where the deal is, where the fraud is. Where does that information come from now? If you are honest with yourself, a significant portion of it comes from a screen, from a phone, from a feed, from reviews written by strangers whose names you do not know and faces you have never seen, from recommendations from accounts that might be real people, or might be brand representatives, or might be the modern equivalent of the coney catcher, dressed as a friendly local with inside knowledge. The medieval marketplace was, as I described many evenings ago, the town's living newspaper. The place where the information that governed everyday economic life circulated in person, among people who could assess each other's trustworthiness by looking them in the eye, by knowing their reputation, by asking someone who had dealt with them before. Now consider what we have built instead. The review system, the rating, the follower count, the verified badge. These are our versions of the market reputation economy attempts to reconstruct in digital form the trust infrastructure that the physical marketplace provided automatically through the simple fact of people knowing each other and meeting face to face. They work after a fashion. They also have exactly the vulnerabilities you would expect fake reviews purchased, followers, counterfeit verification influencer accounts that function precisely like a coney catcher operating in a crowd of strangers. The problems have not changed, the geography has. But here is what I find genuinely hopeful, and I want to end there rather than in melancholy. The market keeps coming back, not always in the same form, not always in the same place. But the impulse that created it, the need to gather to exchange not just goods but information and contact, and the reassurance of other people being present and managing that impulse does not go away. The farmers' market revival in North America, which began in earnest in the 1970s after Congress passed the Farmer-to-Consumer Direct Marketing Act, has by some counts more than tripled the number of public markets in the United States over the last few decades. There are now thousands of them, in cities and small towns, in parking lots and public squares on Saturday mornings, when people who could easily buy everything from a screen choose instead to go somewhere and see faces and smell things and talk to the person who grew what they are buying. This is not nostalgia, or not only nostalgia, it is a recognition being demonstrated week after week in parking lots across the country that something important was built into the old design. Something that the efficient, convenient transactional replacement did not include, and that the absence of that something is felt even when people cannot precisely name what is missing. In York, England, the Shambles Market still operates. It is open every day now, a modern market in the shadow of one of Europe's best-preserved medieval streets. 2025 travellers voted it one of the top 10% of markets in the world on a major travel platform. People travel from across the country and across the ocean to stand in a market square in a city where markets have been held since at least the Domesday Book of 1086. Nearly 1,000 years, the same square, the same basic impulse. Something in that persists because something in it is true. I want to tell you what I actually believe the old marketplace was, not what it sold. Not how it was organised, not the rules or the fraud or the smells or the people, all of which we have spent 12 evenings exploring and which are real and important and worth knowing. What it was at its heart, it was a place where people agreed to need each other, not sentimentally, practically. The farmer needed the cloth merchant needed the blacksmith needed the baker needed the miller needed the farmer. Round and round every Wednesday and Saturday, season after season, year after year, all of these needs flowing toward a central point where they could be met. The market was the physical expression of interdependence, of the fact that no person in any period of human history has ever survived entirely alone, that we are creatures who require each other for food, for tools for information, for the basic reassurance that someone else exists and is more or less managing. The square filled up every week because that need did not go away between market days. It just waited. And the square emptied again because the need for the moment had been met. And 5 days later, before dawn, someone was setting up a stall in the dark again. Here is the question I want to leave you with tonight. Where is your marketplace? Not metaphorically, genuinely. Where is the place in your life where you meet the people you need, where you find out what is actually happening, where you assess who is trustworthy and who is not, where the stranger from somewhere different brings something you could not have found locally, where the community's needs become visible and the mechanisms for meeting them come together. It might be a screen. Partially, probably yes, and there is something true in that however imperfect the digital version of trust and community turns out to be, but I hope it is also somewhere physical, somewhere with a smell and a sound and other people's faces, somewhere that requires you to be present, that cannot be paused or scrolled past, that makes small demands on your patience and your attention, and gives back something that a screen for all its efficiency cannot quite replicate. The marketplace is not gone. It has changed shape the way it has changed shape every century for the past 1,000 years. It has adapted to refrigeration and railroads and supermarkets and the internet the way it adapted to plague and war and the collapse of currencies and the arrival of strangers with things nobody had seen before. It will adapt again. It always has. Because the need that created it is not going anywhere. 12 evenings, 1 square, a fishmonger and a baker and a woman folding silk and a blacksmith reading fire by colour, and a child in the afternoon light searching the cobblestones for a coin. The bell rang this morning before any of us were awake, and the square filled up, and it rang again in the afternoon and the square emptied. Somewhere in England right now the shambles is quiet. The stalls are folded, the stones are cold. In 5 days it will fill again. It has been filling and emptying for 1,000 years, and if you close your eyes you can still hear it just at the edge of hearing, just before sleep takes you. The sound of a Wednesday morning coming together before the first light, before any of us arrived. The first cart on the cobblestones. The first cry in the dark. Thank you for being here across all 12 of these evenings. If this series has meant something to you, and I hope it has, please share it with someone who might feel the same way. The stories we visited here are real, and they belong to all of us. Sleep well,